Chapter 51, Guilt. Nick took a deep breath. "Thank you. I will do just that," he said. The doctor nodded. After a bit more talking, the doctor left the warehouse. "What's your plan?" Wintour asked. "What I said," Nick said. "I will support Horua until he wakes up." Wintour furrowed his brows. "Nick, I need you as my chief Zephix extractor. I can't have you take care of the boy if you can't do your job properly." "I have to," Nick said with a tone filled with conviction. "This is my responsibility, and I am the one that has to pay the price. If Horua dies now, everything would have been for nothing. I have already hurt Horua immensely, and I can't even imagine hurting him even more. This is all my fault, and I am going to deal with it." Wintour frowned. However, he wasn't actually mad at Nick. The entire incident with Horua had given Nick something that he had lacked: a sense of responsibility. A chief Zephix extractor needed a strong sense of responsibility, or the entire manufacturer might go out of business. If something happened, Nick had to deal with these things and take responsibility. "As long as your work does not suffer, it doesn't matter what you do in your free time," Wintour said. "Thank you, Wintour," Nick said with a sigh. However, Wintour added, "I don't want him here. I will rent a room somewhere, and he can stay in the bed there. The room will be pretty close to the company, which should make it easy for you to take care of him." Nick wasn't the biggest fan of Wintour's help, but he knew that he needed to accept some help if he wanted to deal with this issue. "Okay," Nick said. "Thank you, Wintour." Wintour nodded. "For now, you should work. Peitor will deal with Horua for the next 8 hours." Nick felt guilty that Peitor had to do more work because of his mistake. But Nick also knew that he didn't have any other choice. He couldn't let Horua stay alone for 8 full hours. So, Nick just nodded. He threw one last glance at Horua. Whenever he saw Horua like this, Nick felt an intense pain in his chest, and breathing became more difficult. Guilt. Such heavy guilt. Nick released another sigh and entered the Dreamer's containment unit. As always, the Dreamer just stood in its corner as it looked into Nick's eyes. "He's still alive," Nick said. The Dreamer showed no reaction. Nick snorted. "I guess you don't really care. For now, I will be mainly working with you, but in the future, I will bring in more people. However, these people will be more resilient than the last person you worked with," Nick said. The Dreamer showed no reaction. A moment later, Nick sat down near one of the walls and closed his eyes. "Let's get to it," he said. Clank, clank, clank. Nick heard the Dreamer's footsteps, and he knew that it now stood just beside him again. The prefix in the room became denser, and Nick started to feel sleepy. A minute later, Nick fell asleep. In his dreams, Horua was dying in increasingly more painful ways as he screamed for Nick's help. Naturally, it was always Nick's fault that Horua was dying. Eventually, the Horuas even started to come alive again and told Nick that he was at fault. Even the world turned into living bodies of Horua, and whenever Nick walked, the Horua he stepped on screamed in pain and died. The world was screaming at him, telling him that he was the reason why suffering filled all of reality. Nick broke down again and again. Nick had uttered the sentence so many times, but Nurse Alice had never come. Nick tried to kill himself, but he couldn't. No matter what he did, he survived. His suffering was infinite and eternal. And then, Nick woke up. All the memories of Nick's dream became hazier and hazier by the second. Just a moment later, Nick had forgotten nearly everything. He only knew that his dreams had been related to Horua, and that he felt very guilty. That was all he knew. Nick looked around in the containment unit and saw the Dreamer looking at him from its corner. Nick sighed and stood up. After leaving the containment unit, Nick was intercepted by Wintour. "Nick, we need to talk," Wintour said with a serious expression. As soon as he heard that, Nick felt anxiety and fear rise in his chest. "Did something happen to Horua?" he asked. "No," Wintour said. "This is more of a good thing." "Oh, okay," Nick said with a sigh of relief. "Look at this," Wintour said as he pointed at the Zephix gauge. Right now, the gauge was at 10 grams of Zephix. "What about it?" Nick asked. "Every day the Zephix tank gets emptied," Wintour said, "which means that it was at 0 before you and the boy arrived." "Okay," Nick asked. Nick, the boy only produced 3 grams of Zephyx. That means you produced 7 grams just now, 40% more than the last time you worked with it. Nick's eyes widened. How? That's what I'm asking you, Wintour asked. What has changed? Nick furrowed his brows. He had no idea. I don't know, Nick said. Wintour nodded. Then find out. It's your job. Well, okay, Nick said with uncertainty. How was he supposed to find out why the amount of Zephyx had changed? The boy is in the house across the street, Wintour said as he took out a key. This is one of 3 keys. The owner of the hotel has one. Petor has one. You have one. Nick took hold of the key and looked at it. Thanks, Wintour, he said. Wintour nodded. See you tomorrow, he said before he grabbed his suitcase and left the building. Apparently, Wintour had remained here just to talk with Nick. Now, Nick was alone. After some seconds, Nick took a deep breath and left the warehouse. It was time to visit Horua. Chapter 52. Caregiver. Nick entered the house opposite the warehouse. It was quite a big building with 5 floors. By now, Nick had gotten used to seeing these big and clean houses, and he wasn't currently in the mood to go sightseeing. He only wanted to see Horua. Nick had already seen on the key that Horua would be on the 2nd floor, and in just a couple of seconds he finally arrived. He put the key in the lock and unlocked it. It took a bit of getting used to since keys basically didn't exist in the dregs. The room was silent. It was almost like there was no life in this room. However, Nick quickly saw Horua on the bed. Right now, Horua was sitting on the bed, looking forward with dead eyes. In a certain way, Horua's current appearance reminded Nick of the dreamer. They both had dead eyes. Horua was wearing comfortable pajamas, and if it weren't for his impure skin due to living in the dregs, he would look like any other child from the outer city. In the pajamas, Horua looked even more like a child than normal. Nick took a deep breath and walked over. Hey, Horua, everything all right? Nick asked, not expecting an answer. Naturally, he didn't get one. Nick walked over and put his right arm on Horua's shoulder as he looked at him. Horua, I just wanted to say that all of this is my fault, and that I am genuinely sorry, Nick said. I should have known that not everyone can resist a specter just like this. Maybe I should have moved slower? Maybe I should have introduced the dreamer to you when you were older. I mean, I didn't need you to immediately become a Zephyx extractor. Nick was just looking into Horua's dead eyes with a sigh. I'm sorry. I wish I had been smarter. Sadly, I can't change the past. So the next best thing is to make a bright future for you. Nick remained silent for a couple of seconds. Hey, how about I give you a massage? Nick asked. Then, Nick slowly moved Horua onto his stomach. The doctor said that we have to regularly move your body, or your health will suffer. Don't worry, I'll make sure that nothing like that will happen. A moment later, Nick started to massage Horua's body. For someone who wasn't technically conscious, Horua's muscles were quite strained. How does this feel? Nick asked. Naturally, Horua didn't answer. For around 30 minutes, Nick kept massaging Horua's body while talking to him. After some time, Nick just started telling Horua about his day at work and what their plans were. Nick wasn't worried about keeping secrets since Horua officially belonged to their company. When the massage was done, Nick grabbed a bowl and filled it with water. Nick put the bowl to Horua's mouth, and surprisingly, Horua swallowed when water entered his mouth. For just a moment, Nick became hopeful, yet Horua showed no other reaction. All right, that should be enough, Nick said. Do you want some food next? Silence. I'll get you some food, okay? Nick silently walked out of the room and entered the street. After looking around for a bit, Nick found a nice place that sold soup. Even though the price was outrageous, Nick didn't complain. This was for Horua, which made the price seem unimportant. Nick returned and slowly fed the soup to Horua. After a bit of talking, Nick noticed that the room started to smell. He quickly found the source. Horua had just wet his clothing and the bed. Nick could only sigh. The doctor said he couldn't go to the toilet on his own. Over the next few minutes, Nick also dealt with that mess. Nick even went out to buy Horua several new sets of pajamas. For the next couple of hours, Nick just remained in the room with Horua to talk. Eventually, Nick became tired, and he reluctantly left Horua. I will be back in 4 hours to check on you, okay? Nick said before leaving the room. Nick went to the reception of the hotel and rented a room on the same floor as Horua. The room wasn't anything special. It was made of clean metal, and it looked quite nice, just like Horua's bed. Nick's bed was made of a thick sheet of fabric that made it much easier to sleep. A couple minutes later, Nick went to bed. Yet no matter what he did, Nick couldn't fall asleep. Nick was definitely tired, but for some reason, sleep just wouldn't come to him. Even more, Nick felt more and more nervous. I hope Horua is okay. No one is checking up on him. What if he wet the bed again and has to sleep in his own urine? What if he is thirsty? What if his breathing stopped? After over half an hour of trying, Nick left his room and went back into Horua's room. Horua was lying in bed, just as Nick had left him. Nothing had changed. Nick took a deep breath and went back to his room. Yet he still couldn't fall asleep, and he became nervous again. An hour later, he returned to Horua's room again. Nothing had changed. Nick wanted to leave again, but he just didn't feel comfortable with leaving Horua alone. So Nick just remained in Horua's room. He was tired, but he didn't try to sleep. However, since Horua might be asleep, Nick also didn't talk to him. He just remained in the room in silence without doing anything. As more time passed, Nick felt a tightness in his chest. "I'm sorry," Nick whispered. "I didn't want this to happen." Silence. Nick just looked at Horua, different memories of him shooting through his mind. "I am so sorry," Nick repeated. Slowly, Nick's eyes started to get wet, and eventually tears started to flow down his face. "Horua, I'm so sorry. I was such an idiot. I just want you to recover. It's fine if you hate me forever. I just want you to recover." Nick's crying intensified. "I'm so sorry." Chapter 53, Interview. "So how are you with bad situations?" Nick asked the person in front of him. In front of Nick was a woman in her early 20s. She had brown hair and wore dirty clothes. Obviously, she was from the dregs. Right now, Nick was interviewing her inside his room in the hotel. The woman had originally been quite nervous about having a meeting for a job inside someone's room, but by now, she had realized that Nick wasn't trying to hurt her. "I think I can react in a very calm and deliberate manner," the woman said casually. Nick nodded. "Have you ever met a specter?" "I don't have an ability if that's your question," the woman said. "All right. But have you met a specter before?" Nick repeated. The woman frowned. "I think so, but I'm not sure," she said. "Oh, please elaborate," Nick said. "Well," the woman started, "legend has it that the leader of the Riker Strikers is a specter, and I met him before." "Oh, that's a new one," Nick said. "What makes you think he's a specter?" "It's just a legend," the woman said. "People say that Riker has to be a specter. After all, the Riker Strikers are the only gang that brings nothing positive to the dregs. The insurance gang might have some very direct methods, but they protect the people's tax money. The peddlers might charge exorbitant prices and don't allow any competition. But they have the ability to get all these important goods to the dregs. Without them, so many more people would die. The hub might not care about morals when they accept a mission, but they also give many jobs to a lot of people. Even more, they keep the different gangs in check since the hub can essentially be bought out by them. But the Riker Strikers," the woman shook her head. "The Riker Strikers just steal, rape, and assassinate. They want money without offering protection. They secretly kill people for seemingly no reason. There's nothing good about them, not even a little bit. What human would create something like that? Isn't it easier to lead a group of willing humans than forcefully take their belongings every day? At least that's the explanation," the woman explained. "If Riker is a specter, these things would make sense." Nick scratched his chin in interest as he looked at the woman. "That's a very interesting theory. I never met Riker personally since I worked for the hub most of the time. You said you did?" The woman nodded. "It was when 3 men stalked me to my house. I wasn't sure if they just wanted my money or if they also wanted to rape me, but luckily, I never found out." When the woman had talked about the possibility of getting sexually assaulted, she had seemed quite calm, cold, and indifferent, even though something like that probably terrified most people. During that time, I was on a long-term mission for the hub, and I showed them my symbol as proof. Based on their expressions, the three of them didn't like that, but they decided to leave me be. That was until Riker appeared. I don't know why he was here, but based on how the three men acted and how they addressed Riker, I knew it was the leader of the Riker strikers. When he saw what happened, he just put on a friendly smile and asked since when the Riker strikers cared about what the other gangs thought of them. The three of them turned back to me and started to advance. Meanwhile, I turned around and ran away. Luckily, one of the hub's outposts was very close, and I managed to enter and get help. The three men fled, but a group from the hub ran after them. I never saw them again after that. And I also didn't hear anything about Riker again, the woman explained. Nick nodded a couple of times. How was the infamous Riker? How was he? The woman repeated as she furrowed her brows. It's difficult to describe. He looked quite charming and beautiful. Back then, I thought he looked abhorrent, but after so many weeks, I can admit that he is very attractive from a general perspective. He has this entire playboy vibe to him, but there is also deep confidence in his gaze. The woman seemed uncomfortable for a couple of seconds. I'm not sure if this is relevant, she said eventually, but I felt like his eyes were strange. They looked just like any other pair of eyes, but when I looked into them, I felt like I was looking at some kind of natural predator of mine. He felt very, very dangerous. I felt like I had to run away from him no matter what. The next moment she snorted. Ironically enough, this feeling of having to run away was what allowed me to react this quickly to his men's renewed advance. Nick looked very intrigued. What if you met him again? Nick asked. In what sense? The woman asked. Alone, Nick answered. Just you two. A sneer of disgust appeared on the woman's face. I would love nothing more than to say that I would kill him, but I probably don't have the strength to do that. I don't think a gang leader is weak, she said. When Nick heard that, a bright smile appeared on his face. All right, that sounds good, he said. The woman looked at Nick with newfound anxiety. So, did everything go well? I feel like it went well. Nick chuckled and nodded. Yep, everything sounds great. So does that mean? The woman asked. Nick nodded. Yes, I think you are the right person for the job. The woman's eyes widened in shock. A Zephix extractor. She was about to become a Zephix extractor? She almost couldn't believe it. Your name was Jennifer, right? Nick asked. Yes, Jennifer asked. Please call me Jenny. Of course, Nick said. The next moment, Nick stood up. Would you mind waiting outside the hotel for around 15 minutes? I have to deal with something first. After that, I will show you where you will be working from now on. Of course, thank you so much, Jenny said with a grateful voice. The two of them left Nick's room. While Jenny left the hotel, Nick went to Horua's room. Nick had to check up on Horua before leaving for work. Chapter 54, Dark Dream. Nick arrived in Horua's room and saw that it was time to change Horua's clothing again. By now, Nick had taken care of Horua for over 2 weeks, and he had gotten pretty good at it. Over the past 2 weeks, Nick had searched for someone who could join as another Zephix extractor. This time, Nick was very careful when it came to choosing someone. After all, he didn't want to make the same mistake again. Nick had painfully learned why all the Zephix manufacturers had such stringent and difficult tests before anyone could join as a Zephix extractor. Just because Nick could interact with a Spectre didn't mean that everyone could. In fact, interacting with a Spectre was one of the scariest things in existence. Humans instinctually felt that the thing in front of them preyed on them. After the incident with Horua, Nick decided to use the entrance exam he had undertaken in Ghosty's lab as a guide for creating his own exams. Except, Nick didn't have all the facilities for the tests. So, the next best thing was to just hold an interview with someone while trying to gauge their abilities in a conversation. Nick had interviewed over 20 people from the dregs by now, but he hadn't been happy with any of them. There always was some kind of problem. Sometimes, Nick felt like they were lying to him, and Nick didn't like liars. Sometimes Nick felt like what the people were saying sounded unrealistic. For example, someone once said that they would simply beat up a Spectre if they ever saw one. Luckily, Nick didn't find any of these problems with Jenny. Jenny was very honest and easy to work with, but when she talked about someone she didn't like, she seemed very cold and distant. The best thing was that she didn't show any fear, but Nick also didn't feel like she was simply putting on a front. In a sense, Nick felt like Jenny had no fight or flight instinct, but just a fight instinct. Even more, Jenny had honestly said that she ran away from the Riker strikers without any shame. She was confident in her choice. "Hey, Horua," Nick said with a smile as he grabbed a freshly cleaned pair of pajamas. "I finally found someone for the position." Horua didn't answer. Her name is Jenny, and she seems to have quite a character. Nick told Horua about Jenny while he cleaned up Horua's mess and changed his clothing. When he was done, he also gave Horua a quick massage. "Anyway, I told her it would only be 15 minutes, and I've been here for nearly 20. Sorry, Horua, but I gotta go. See you later," Nick said. After quietly closing the door, Nick left the hotel. Jenny was waiting in front of the hotel, and when she saw that Nick had come out, she released a sigh of relief. Apparently, she had been worried that Nick had stood her up. "Sorry, took a bit longer than expected," Nick said with a helpless smile. "Oh, it's fine," Jenny said with a polite smile. "Anyway, let me show you where you will be working." When Jenny saw that Nick simply entered the warehouse on the other side of the street, she became quite shocked. Who held an interview in front of their company's building. But when Jenny saw the sturdy walls of the containment unit, she realized that this was not just a simple warehouse. Compared to the walls of the warehouse, the walls of the containment unit had an incredible feeling of power to them. Even more, there were many cables and contraptions scattered around the containment unit. After 2 weeks, the company had also slightly redecorated its interior. By now, there were a couple of pieces of art made of metal strewn around, and there were also far more desks and chairs. On top of that, things had been cleaned up, and a couple of walls made of thin metal separated parts of the warehouse into a couple of rooms. Basically, all of this had been done by Pator at Wintor's request. Nick led Jenny to the door of one of the isolated rooms and loudly knocked on it. "Hey, Wintor, I got someone. Come in," Wintor shouted from behind the door. Jenny looked nervously at the door. Nick opened the door and led Jenny in. The inside of Wintor's office looked different from the rest of the company. For example, his chair and desk looked much better than all the other ones, and he also had a huge bookshelf with many different books on it. Almost all of the books were about specters. When Wintor saw Jenny, a small gleam appeared in his eyes, and he stood up. "Welcome," Wintor said with a smile. "My name is Wintor Melfion, and I am the president and CEO of Dark Dream." Jenny blinked a couple of times. "Dark Dream? Hasn't Nick told you about the name of our company?" Wintor asked with a smile. "No, I didn't," Nick said. "The NDA thing, you know?" Wintor just chuckled politely. "Of course." Then Wintor turned to Jenny again. "So you will be joining Dark Dream as a new Zephix extractor, right?" "Yes, sir," Jenny said with nervousness. For some reason, Wintor felt much more imposing and powerful than Nick to her. "Perfect," Wintor said before pointing at a chair. "Please, sit down. I want to ask you a couple of things and tell you a bit more about Dark Dream." While Jenny sat down, Nick walked out of the door. "I'll get to work then. Tell Pator to take care of Horua." "Of course," Wintor said. "Thanks," Nick said. "Should I leave the door open or closed?" "Close it," Wintor said. Nick nodded and closed the door. While Nick walked over to the Dreamer's containment unit, Wintor looked at Jenny with a friendly smile. For several minutes, Wintor asked Jenny questions, and the more he heard about her, the more fitting she seemed to be for Dark Dream. Nick actually got a good one this time, Wintor thought. While Nick was sleeping in the containment unit, Wintor took out several sheets of paper for Jenny to sign. After signing all of them, Wintor smiled again. "Thank you, and welcome to Dark Dream." Chapter 55, Jenny and the Dreamer. By now, Nick had gotten pretty good at working with the Dreamer, and working with it no longer required special preparations. While Nick was working with the Dreamer, Wintor was telling Jenny everything relevant about Dark Dream, her future workplace. From what Wintor told her, their company was named Dark Dream due to their first specter, the Dreamer. When Nick had captured the specter, he needed to brave the darkness and the Dreamer. So, Wintour had come up with the name Dark Dream. When Jenny heard about how Nick had captured the dreamer, her respect for him had grown even more. Jenny had already respected Nick, but it was still difficult to feel true respect for someone who was still a teenager. Naturally, Jenny also knew how impressive it was to fall under the nightmare's influence so many times. The more often it happened in a short time frame, the more brutal the visions became. 8 hours later, Nick walked out of the containment unit as he yawned a bit. Even though he had just slept for 8 hours, he felt very exhausted and tired. The first thing Nick did after coming out of the containment unit was to check on the amount of Zephyx he had produced. Still 7 grams. Except for that one change 2 weeks ago, nothing else changed. It's still 7 grams. Nick thought as he rubbed his chin in thought. With Jenny, I should be able to glean some more information. Nick looked around and quickly found Jenny. Right now, Pator was showing her a couple of things in the warehouse. "Hey, Jenny," Nick shouted as he came closer. Pator and Jenny turned to Nick. "Good work today, Nick," Pator said with a friendly smile. "Welcome back, sir," Jenny said with a bit of nervousness. "Sir?" Nick repeated with a chuckle. "Just call me Nick." Jenny seemed a bit unsure. "Sure thing, Nick," she said with a bit of discomfort. Nick just nodded with a smile. "Jenny, do you have somewhere to be in the next 8 hours?" "No," Jenny answered. Nick nodded. "Today is your first day, but if you feel up to it, you can work with the dreamer right now." Nick didn't care that Pator was present. By now, Pator was also under an NDA, and he had already heard a lot about Dark Dream's secrets. Jenny looked with a bit of excitement at Nick. "This means I would also get my first payment, right?" "Sure, that's not an issue," Nick said. "Then I would like to work with the dreamer right now," Jenny said. "Although I need to inform my partner at home first. She hasn't heard from me the entire day, and she will be very worried if I stay until deep into the night." "Pator can do that," Nick said before turning to Pator. "Right?" "Naturally," Pator said with a smile. "I'll deal with it after visiting Horua again." "Thanks, Pator," Nick said. "If everything goes as planned, I can take over in about an hour or so." "Sure thing, Nick," Pator said before turning to Jenny. "Where's your home?" Jenny gave Pator instructions on what to say and where to go, and Pator quickly left the building. The next moment, Nick smiled at Jenny. "Then let's go." Jenny nodded and followed after Nick. Both of them looked to be calm, but in truth, both of them were quite nervous. Jenny had never truly interacted with a specter. She wanted to seem fearless, but deep inside she was still worried that the specter's presence would be too much for her to handle. Nick wanted to seem confident, but he was just as nervous as Jenny. The last time he had introduced someone to the dreamer, that person had become catatonic. Nick hoped that Jenny could resist the dreamer better. After opening the employee door, both of them walked into the containment unit. As always, the dreamer stood in its corner, looking at Nick expressionlessly. Jenny stood diagonally behind Nick, and when she saw the dreamer, her heart rate increased by quite a bit. Jenny took a deep breath as her chest shook, but she managed to keep her composure. Just as expected, the dreamer's aura was hard to bear for Jenny. She felt like she was in contact with her natural predator. Remaining here spelled nothing but death, and her emotions were telling her to run away. However, Jenny's rationality kept her emotions in check, stopping them from dictating her actions. She had already been informed about the dreamer, and she knew what she had to do. "Nothing will happen to me," Jenny thought while taking deep breaths, trying to calm herself. "I will not die. The only thing to fear is fear itself." The next moment, the dreamer looked away from Nick and looked into Jenny's eyes. Jenny's heart rate increased even more as she started to sweat coldly. However, she just gritted her teeth and looked back. When Nick saw her reaction, he smiled. "All right," Nick said, looking at the dreamer. "This is Jenny. You will be working for 8 hours after our sessions every day." The dreamer didn't react. Silence. "Well, seems like there are no issues," Nick said with a casual shrug. Jenny wasn't put at ease by Nick's casual demeanor. "All right," Nick said, turning to Jenny. "Where do you want to sleep?" "I usually sleep with my back against the wall, but you don't have to do that." Jenny took a deep breath. I'd like to sit in a corner. Sure, Nick said. The next moment, Jenny went to one of the corners and awkwardly sat down. Nick nodded. The dreamer will now come to you and put you to sleep. Don't resist its influence. After all, we want you to sleep. Jenny nervously nodded. Nick looked over at the dreamer. You can start. The dreamer slowly turned to look at Jenny. Clink, 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 and slowly walked up to her. All of Jenny's being was telling her to run as far away as she could. She was about to die. However, Jenny managed to keep her emotions in check and kept forcing her eyes closed. After a couple of seconds, Jenny started to feel tired. She wanted to resist the influence, but once again, she managed to keep her emotions in check. Eventually, she got too tired to even think about resisting. And then, she fell asleep. Chapter 56, Successful Session. When Nick saw Jenny fall asleep, he nodded with pride. That went quite smoothly, he thought. For the next 30 minutes, Nick waited in the containment unit to make sure that nothing was happening. Nothing happened. I will be back in a bit, Nick told the dreamer as he left the containment unit. Naturally, the dreamer didn't answer. How did it go? Wintour asked, standing in front of the exit of the containment unit. Perfect, Nick said with a grin. She was obviously scared, but she didn't run away and voluntarily sat down to sleep. Wintour also smiled. You found a good one this time, Nick. Nick nodded. Yep, if everything works out, she will take the shift after mine, which should be from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. I will arrive at 6 a.m. now every morning since I'm not the only one working with the dreamer anymore. Sounds great, Wintour said. Now we only need one more person. Nick sighed. I'm not looking forward to more of these interviews, but that's why I'm getting paid more. Wintour chuckled a bit. That's how it works, yes. Is Petor back? Nick asked. He's outside, Wintour said. Nick nodded and walked out of the door. Nick quickly found Petor and talked to him a bit before going back to the hotel. After entering Horua's room, a bitter smile appeared on Nick's face, and he sat on the bed beside Horua. As always during the day, Horua sat on his bed, just looking into empty space without doing anything. Hey, Horua, you remember the new employee I told you about this morning? Nick talked to Horua for a while, telling him everything about his day. After that, Nick got Horua some soup and some water. I'll be right back. I also have to check up on Jenny, Nick said before going back to the warehouse. Nick entered the containment unit and saw that nothing had changed. For the next 8 hours, Nick went back and forth between the warehouse and Horua's room. Finally, the 8 hours were up, and it was time for Nick to wake up Jenny. Hey, 8 hours are over, Nick said to the dreamer still standing over Jenny. The dreamer had been focused on Jenny's closed eyes, but a moment later, its head slowly moved back. It slowly turned to look at Nick before going back to its corner. Nick just nodded before walking up to Jenny. After gently nudging her for a while, Jenny slowly opened her eyes. But then, her eyes suddenly shot open, and she immediately pulled her arms up like she was trying to protect herself from an attacker. Wow. Wow. Calm down, Jenny, Nick shouted. Jenny froze. Nick? She asked in confusion. Then, she slowly lowered her arms and looked around. Oh, right, she shouted before her eyes fixed on the dreamer. She still felt scared looking at it, but it was not as bad as before. Is it over? Jenny asked. Yep, Nick answered. 8 hours are up. You successfully finished your first session with a specter. Congratulations. Jenny almost couldn't believe it. She had done it. She had actually worked with a specter. So, did this mean that she was a real Zephix extractor now? She didn't feel any different, though. Come, let's go out, Nick said. Jenny looked more at the dreamer as she followed Nick out of the containment unit. When the door closed behind her, she felt like a huge pressure had vanished from her shoulder. Want to see how much Zephix you made? Nick asked with a smile. Jenny's eyes opened wide with intrigue, and she nodded. Nick led her to the console and looked at the gauge. Yet, when Nick saw the results, he was surprised. 4 grams, he said with interest. Is that a lot? Jenny asked. For the company, 4 grams represent 4,000 credits, Nick said. For you, It represents 400 credits. Jenny just looked with shock and surprise at the gauge. 400 credits. She had just earned 400 credits for just 8 hours of work. For just this bit of work, Jenny had secured 2 months of taxes for her and her partner. It was ridiculous. "Want your money?" Nick asked. Jenny felt a bit put on the spot, but she still nodded sheepishly. "Sorry, but I really need it." "Of course," Nick said with a chuckle. "Wintour already went home. So let me get your money." Nick walked over to Wintour's office and opened it with a key. Inside Wintour's office, Nick took out a thin sheet of malleable metal and put it on the desk. The next moment, Nick grabbed a couple of different metallic stamps and heated them on some kind of hot plate. Lastly, Nick stamped the number 400 into the malleable piece of metal and then stamped Dark Dream's official stamp on the bottom. After waiting for a bit, Nick grabbed the bottom of the piece of metal and pulled. A second piece of metal with a different color was pulled out of the first piece of metal. The second piece of metal also had the number 400 and the company's stamp on it. Naturally, the first piece of metal was some kind of document that allowed the owner to take 400 credits out of Dark Dream's account, and the second piece of metal was a copy. Nick left the copy on Wintour's desk and left with the first piece of metal. "Here you go," Nick said, handing the first piece of metal to Jenny. Jenny just looked at it with confusion. "Hand this to this bank," Nick said, pointing at a symbol at the corner of the piece of metal. "They will keep the plate and give you 400 credits in exchange." Jenny looked with wonder at the plate. "By the way," Nick said, remembering something, "you should have an ability now." Jenny looked at Nick with a bit of confusion. "You know an ability from a specter," Nick said. "The very thing that makes Zephix extractors. Jenny realized what Nick meant and looked at her hands with wonder. "What kind of ability?" she asked. "I don't know. Chapter 57. Ability." Jenny just looked at Nick with dumbfounded confusion. "I have no idea," Nick repeated. "My Zephix synchronizer was already attuned when I came into contact with the Dreamer, which was why I didn't get its ability. And the only other person who worked with it is in some sort of coma." "Coma?" Jenny asked in shock. "Yeah. I didn't want to tell you before you worked with the Dreamer, since it would make you more nervous without a good reason," Nick said. "Let's just say that I messed up with the last person. I took someone that obviously didn't have the mental fortitude to work with a specter. But I believed in you, and my trust was not misplaced." Jenny became a bit more nervous when she heard that someone had been put into a coma because of the Dreamer. "What happened?" Jenny asked. Nick sighed. "After 5 hours, the Dreamer walked away from him, and he started to have a seizure. He hasn't really woken up since then. That was about 2 weeks ago. You, on the other hand, finished the full 8 hours, which means that you're not in danger," Nick added. Jenny was still a bit uncertain, but she didn't complain. She had just earned 400 credits, which was insane. "Anyway," Nick said, "you should really try to find out what kind of ability you unlocked. If you feel uncomfortable trying alone, we can try tomorrow. Tomorrow, I need you here at 2 p.m. 2 p.m. on the dot. Enter the containment unit and tell the Dreamer to wake me up. I'll show you how to operate this thing," Nick said as he pointed at the console of the containment unit. For the next 10 minutes, Nick showed Jenny how to operate the console, and eventually, Jenny left to go to the bank and home. After Jenny left, Nick went to one part of the containment unit, which he then unlocked with a key. Inside, Nick found a small tube with something that looked like white powder. This was Zephix. Nick carefully took out the tube and put an empty one in before closing the metal plate again. After that, Nick entered Wintour's office and put the tube of Zephix on top of the copy of Jenny's payment. When he was done, Nick nodded once in satisfaction and left the warehouse. Nick checked up on Horua, slept for 4 hours, checked up on Horua again, and slept for another 3 hours. Nick grabbed a quick bite to eat and entered the warehouse. Pater was already here. Pater always had to come early since Nick was working with the Dreamer during this time. After some small talk, Nick entered the Dreamer's containment unit and fell asleep. About 8 hours later, Nick opened his eyes and saw Jenny standing beside him. "Already time to stand up?" Nick asked with a yawn. Jenny nodded with a smile. "Yep." Nick nodded, stood up, and walked out of the containment unit. Jenny followed him. I know what kind of ability I have, Jenny said. Oh, Nick asked with interest. Tell me, I'll show you, Jenny said with some excitement. Don't worry, it won't hurt. Nick nodded. Jenny walked over and put her hands on Nick's head. Nick just looked with confusion at her. Then, Nick yawned again and started to get drowsy. Nick's eyes closed by themselves, and he felt weakness enter his limbs. Jenny slowly removed her hands from Nick's head, and the drowsiness became weaker. Nick opened his eyes again and realized what had happened. You can make people fall asleep? Nick asked. Jenny nodded. Just like the dreamer. Nick was excited to find out, but he also had to furrow his brows. That's not very useful for combat, he said. I thought that too initially, but I'm not so sure anymore, Jenny said. Nick looked at her with a raised eyebrow. If my opponent doesn't know that I'm their opponent, I can get close to them and, well, Jenny explained, as she started to feel a bit awkward. Nick just scratched the back of his head in confusion. And what? He asked. Well, Jenny said. Tell them to come to my place, hug them, and. Oh, that, Nick said. You mean seduce them and covertly use your ability while hugging their head or something, right? Yes, that, Jenny said with a bit of embarrassment. While I use my ability, my opponent falls into a very deep sleep. They won't easily wake up even if I make a lot of noise. While they are asleep, I can probably collapse the entire house, and they would only notice when the ceiling hits them. Nick nodded with interest. Also, that's not everything, Jenny said. Oh, Nick uttered. I can also somewhat look into dreams, Jenny said. Look into dreams? Nick asked. Can you control them like the dreamer? Jenny shook her head. No, I can't do that, but I can somewhat feel what's happening in their dreams. I tried it a bit with my partner last night. I didn't find out a lot, but I think that's because I'm simply not used to this ability yet. With more practice, I can probably find out more. That's very interesting, Nick said with a nod. Have you told Wintour already? Jenny nodded. Yes, he told me that there might be other uses for my ability. When there is an opportunity, he might give me some other tasks. Makes sense, Nick said. By the way, Jenny added, Wintour wants to talk to you. Sure thing, Nick said. I'll talk to him while you're sleeping. Jenny and Nick talked for a bit more before they entered the Dreamer's containment unit. This time, falling asleep was even easier for Jenny. Eventually, Nick left the containment unit and went into Wintour's office. He saw Wintour looking at several sheets of paper. Hey, Wintour, you wanted to see me? Nick asked. Yes, Nick, Wintour said. Please sit down. Wintour gestured to a chair in front of his desk. Nick felt a bit uncomfortable. Chapter 58. Growth. Nick nervously sat down. He knew that something was up since Wintour was taking on a very distant and professional tone. What's up? Nick asked. Wintour took hold of the copy of the metal plate Nick had made the day before and showed it to Nick. This. Nick raised an eyebrow. I know that yesterday was a special day and all since Jenny needed the money quickly. But you can't just forge my signature. If I wanted to, I could sue you and get all of your money, Wintour said. But everything was correct, right? Nick asked. So, there are no issues. Wintour slightly shook his head. Yes, the amount was correct, but you went too far and meddled with my job. I never meddle with your job since it's your job. Nick, you cannot hand out money to people in the name of the company. You do not have the right or the power to do that, Wintour said with a serious voice. Nick furrowed his brows. Then, what should I have done? She needed the money. Call me, Wintour said. I told you how you can reach me. Just call me. I would have arrived within 30 minutes and would have given her the money. Nick looked a bit uncomfortable. You've worked for nearly 16 hours yesterday. I didn't want to waste another hour of your time. I get where you're coming from, Wintour said. But you can't just hand out money. If there is an emergency like the one yesterday, call me. It doesn't matter what happened before that. If there is a genuine emergency, you always need to call me. Nick sighed. Fine. I won't meddle in your tasks anymore, Wintour. Wintour smiled and nodded. Then there are no issues, Nick. The next moment, Wintour took out a metal plate and handed it to Nick. I will give Jenny her money at the same time as you. In general, I look at the revenue from yesterday and hand you two the money at about 2 p.m. when you're both here." Nick nodded and took the metal plate. He could see the number 1,800 on it. Since Nick produced 7 grams of Zephyx, he got 1,400 credits for his own work, and since he was the chief Zephyx extractor, he also got 10% of what Jenny produced, which was another 400 credits. 800 credits in a day. That was a lot, even for the people in the outer city. Usually, people in the outer city earned between 1,500 and 4,000 credits per month. Nick was making 1,800 per day. Sure enough, being a Zephyx extractor was extremely lucrative. Nick took the metal plate and pocketed it. "Everything going well with Jenny?" Wintour asked. Nick nodded. "Nothing to complain about." "Good," Wintour answered with a smile. After some more small talk, Nick left Wintour's office and went to Horua. When Nick entered Horua's room, he saw Pator cleaning up. After greeting each other, Pator told Nick about the next candidates. Nick told Pator to send them to his room in 30 minutes one by one, as always. 30 minutes later, a person walked into Nick's room, and the two of them talked about many things over the next hour. Sadly, the candidate seemed quite fidgety and nervous, which meant that he most likely wasn't a fit for the position of Zephyx extractor. The second person wasn't any better. The third person seemed a bit weird. Just to be careful, Nick refused them. After dealing with Horua again and eating some things, Nick went to wake up Jenny, and the two of them went home. This was how a normal day for Nick went. He woke up, worked with the dreamer, talked a bit with Jenny, got his money, dealt with Horua, interviewed a couple of people, talked with Jenny again, dealt with Horua one more time and went to sleep. One day, about 2 weeks later, Nick finally found a third candidate. His name was Trevor, and he also came from the dregs. Trevor seemed to be quite a confident individual who smirked a lot. He was pretty good at socializing and seemed to be the center of every gathering. Some people perceived him to be annoying, but others found him to be charming and amusing. When he met the dreamer for the first time, he mostly smiled bitterly and cracked several jokes. Apparently, that was his method of coping with intense fear and stressful situations. He was just laughing and trying to lighten the spirits of everyone. Luckily, Trevor managed to work with the dreamer without issues, and 8 hours later, he woke up with his new ability. Just like Jenny, Trevor could put people to sleep and observe part of their dreams. When Wintour met Trevor, he thought that the dreamer's ability fit him very well. Jenny was very straightforward and honest, which meant that deception was not in her blood. However, Trevor was different. Trevor had a very loud and direct personality, and he was good at masking his intentions. If Wintour ever needed some kind of secret agent, Trevor would be a much better fit than Jenny. From now on, Trevor would take the shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. This meant that the dreamer's output had reached its maximum potential. Per day, Nick produced 7 grams of Zephyx, Jenny produced 4 grams of Zephyx, and Trevor produced 5 grams of Zephyx for a total of 16 grams of Zephyx. That meant Dark Dream was bringing in 16,000 credits per day. For one more month, everyone worked with the dreamer. That was when Wintour wanted to talk to Nick again. With the money now flowing in and the dreamer being worked with at full efficiency, it was now time to expand. They needed a second Spectre. Sadly, since the company wasn't earning enough to create a full team of investigators, it was once more up to Nick to find the next Spectre. But this time it wouldn't be as easy. At least, that was what Nick thought. Chapter 59 Levels. We currently have liquid funds of a bit over 400,000 credits. That means we can purchase another containment unit, Wintour said as he sat in front of Nick in his office. 400,000 credits? Nick asked. I thought we only had something like 250,000 credits. There are a couple of tricks that can increase the value of our Zephyx, Wintour said. My job is not only for show after all. If I don't do a good job, the money that comes in doesn't reach its full potential. Nick just nodded. Nick had never suspected that Wintour wasn't working. Even though Nick didn't know what Wintour was doing all day, he still trusted in him. There were probably many things that Wintour was doing that Nick and his 2 employees didn't even notice. So we can get a new containment unit and get a second Spectre? Nick asked. Wintour nodded. I've been in talks with a manufacturer for containment units, and I managed to get quite a good deal. Under normal circumstances, the next level of containment unit costs about 1.5 million credits. But in exchange for exclusively buying their products, I managed to snag one of those for the price of a cheap one at around 450,000 credits. Nick's eyes widened in surprise and wonder. As someone who had never worked in a company before, Wintour's work always seemed so nebulous to Nick. While Nick trusted that Wintour was working, he had never really felt the impact. But now, Nick actually saw what impact Wintour had on the business. The entire business had only brought in something like 250,000 credits of Zephyx for its savings account. Yet due to Wintour, all of that increased to 400,000 credits. And now Wintour had essentially brought in another million credits in goods. Just by cleverly negotiating with some people, Wintour had essentially brought in 4 times as much money as the remaining employees combined. Naturally, without the employees, Wintour wouldn't be able to get that much money. But still, Wintour was increasing the wealth of Dark Dream a lot. The containment unit I am going to purchase has a light tunnel, which means we don't need to light it with artificial light anymore, Wintour explained. Additionally, it can withstand adolescent specters, which should also secure our future with the Dreamer. Due to the Dreamer's rapid growth and since we constantly need to light its containment unit, I will put the Dreamer into the new containment unit. We can use its current containment unit for a new specter. Nick nodded. Nick had noticed that the Dreamer's output of Zephyx had increased a couple of days before. By now, Nick was producing 10 grams of Zephyx, Jenny was producing 6, and Trevor was producing 8. Since the Zephyx production for all employees increased at the same time, it meant that the reason for that was with the Spectre. Nick hadn't been sure what had happened, but Wintour had known. The Dreamer was growing more powerful. Every Spectre needed to feed to become stronger, and the Dreamer was no exception. Naturally, the Dreamer's power increased by giving people nightmares, and by constantly working with it for 2 months, it had gotten a lot of food. According to Wintour's calculations, the Dreamer had reached the peak of the hatchling stage. In every stage there were 5 levels: initial, early, mid, late, peak. Each level had an increase of power of about 1.5 to the previous level. So if an initial hatchling had a power of 1, an early hatchling would have 1.5, a mid hatchling would have about 2.3, a late hatchling would have about 3.4, and a peak hatchling would have about 5. This meant that a peak hatchling was about 5 times as powerful as an initial hatchling. Surprisingly, that was also about equal to Nick's strength increase when his ability was activated. Whenever a Spectre advanced a level, the power of its ability increased, as well as its physical strength. Back when Nick had caught the Dreamer had been a mid-hatchling, close to becoming a late hatchling. This meant its physical power had been about 2.3 times stronger than the power of an initial hatchling. Based on the body and the type of Spectre, an initial hatchling was about as strong as an average adult male or stronger. In the Dreamer's case, it would have been about as strong as an average adult male, since it was not a physical fighter. Naturally, without his ability, Nick's power had also been about as strong as an average adult male, but he still counted as much stronger than average in the dregs since everyone was malnourished. That had been why the Dreamer had been so much more powerful than Nick. But when Nick's ability activated, he had been much more powerful than the Dreamer. Yet, if the Dreamer had been as powerful back then as it was now, Nick wouldn't have been able to put up a fight. It would have simply torn Nick apart. Right now, the Dreamer was just as powerful as Nick had been when he had captured it with his ability active. However, one had to remember that Zephyx extractors could also become more powerful. When the Dreamer produced Zephyx, Nick also absorbed part of the Zephyx. But it was important to note that Nick's increase in power wasn't compromising the Zephyx production. When a Zephyx extractor worked with a Spectre, both of them produced Zephyx, but only the Zephyx produced by the Spectre would be harvested. The Zephyx produced by the Zephyx extractor would never leave the extractor's body and would immediately get absorbed, increasing the extractor's power. In general, the Zephyx the extractor produced was about 20% of what the Spectre produced, but this ratio could vary. This meant if Nick made the Dreamer produce 10 grams of Zephyx, Nick would gain about 2 grams of Zephyx for himself. Under normal circumstances, This would mean that the dreamer would grow 5 times as quickly as Nick. However, one had to remember that the containment unit harvested 90% of the Zephyx, which meant that from the 10 grams produced, the dreamer could only keep 1 gram. But then, one also had to keep in mind that 3 different people were working with the dreamer for a total of about 24 grams of Zephyx every day. This meant per day the dreamer was growing by about 2.4 grams of Zephyx, and Nick was growing by about 2 grams. Yet, due to the difference in level, Nick didn't need as much Zephyx as the dreamer to advance, which meant that he was growing quicker. So, what did this mean for Nick's actual power? Well, just yesterday, Nick had managed to advance another level, and right now, Nick was at the late first stage, or late newbie if one used the unofficial denotion. Chapter 60, Adolescent. In essence, this meant that Nick was about 3.4 times as powerful as he had been when he had caught the dreamer. Since the dreamer didn't have an ability useful for combat, Nick could have probably caught the dreamer even without his ability if he had been that powerful back then. But that didn't mean that specters were no longer dangerous. The physical bodies of the specters were only a small part of their strength. The truly threatening and terrifying part was their ability. For example, due to his family, Wintour had gained a very powerful ability from a specter. The ability wasn't very useful for capturing specters, but it was incredibly useful for staying alive. The ability had come from the specter called the Blinding Light. The Blinding Light was a level 3 specter that looked like a floating ball of light. The specter belonged to Kugelblitz, which was how Wintour had been able to gain its ability. While the Blinding Light could theoretically smash into someone with its body, that was not why it was dangerous. Its true power was its ability to burn people. The Blinding Light could burn any living being in its vicinity, unless they directly looked at it. However, if they directly looked at the Blinding Light, their eyes would burn away. In essence, one was exchanging their sight for survival. If one lost their eyes, they would become immune to the burning effect of the Blinding Light. This effectively meant that one had to fight the Blinding Light without eyes. If the Blinding Light were a hatchling, and if Nick had tried to catch it, things would have turned out very differently. The Blinding Light's ability was actually useful for combat, compared to the Dreamer's ability. Nick wouldn't be sure how to capture the Blinding Light if it were a hatchling, and he also wouldn't be sure if he could survive. Luckily, the Dreamer didn't have a useful ability for combat. When Wintour told Nick about the Blinding Light, he also told him how much he hated it. Wintour had its ability, and to gain its ability, Wintour had needed to lose his eyes 5 times. He said that this had been the most painful experience of his life. Wintour even told Nick that it usually wouldn't take that many times to gain the Blinding Light's ability. Usually people only needed to have their eyes burned thrice. Some even got it after only 2 times, but Wintour needed 5 times. Of course, Nick asked why, and Wintour's answer was pretty simple. It means I'm not talented in producing Zephyx. It means I have no talent for becoming a Zephyx extractor. Naturally, being a Zephyx extractor was one of the most prestigious professions in the world, and it was more than enough to become an heir to the Melphion family. Yet since Wintour had no talent, he had to go the administrative route and become an amazing businessman. But for that, he needed money, which was why they were now talking about getting a second specter. Don't forget that, even though you've grown much more powerful, a specter, even a hatchling, can still prove to be your death, Wintour said with a warning tone. Naturally, I don't expect you to go after an adolescent specter. The Dreamer will become an adolescent specter soon enough, and it will occupy the new containment unit. This means we need another hatchling. Nick nodded. Anyway, Wintour continued. I followed up on Jenny's clue regarding the Riker strikers. Oh, Nick uttered, looking at Wintour with interest. I found out quite some interesting pieces of information, Wintour said. For example, the Riker strikers have only appeared in the dregs about 5 years ago. Before that, there had been no Riker strikers. Nick nodded. He remembered that no one had talked about the Riker strikers back then, but they very quickly appeared. It was almost like they became extremely powerful overnight. Back then, Nick had barely been 11 years old, and he had been busy getting his own life on track, which was why he had barely noticed anything. Their leader, Riker, had also seemingly appeared out of nowhere, Wintour continued. Well, seemingly, after a lot of digging, I actually found some sightings of him before he became the leader of the Riker strikers. Based on witness accounts, Riker was someone that worked for the hub, and he accepted basically every single dirty mission that gave a lot of money. He mostly did assassinations, beating people up, extorting money, threatening people, and so on. He amassed quite a bit of wealth for the Dreg's standards. Now, if this were everything, he wouldn't seem strange. But there are two things that rubbed me the wrong way when I heard them, Wintour said. Nick leaned forward with interest. First, Wintour said as he lifted his right index finger, he didn't always accept the job with the biggest paycheck. Of course, under normal circumstances, that doesn't seem strange. After all, jobs that pay very well often require you to do horrible things or very dangerous things. But in his case, the opposite was true. He didn't actually aim for the best-paying jobs, but for the jobs that needed him to commit the most horrible acts. Nick's eyes widened in surprise. People just think that he went for the jobs with the biggest reward since those jobs were also the most horrifying ones, most of the time. I understand that some people want a lot of money, but it is very strange that he specifically ignores money just so he can commit more horrible deeds, Wintour said. Nick furrowed his brows and nodded. Yes, that doesn't seem normal. Wintour also nodded. The second thing is even more surprising. Wintour leaned forward. Not even a single merchant that sells food recalls ever selling food to Riker. Nick's eyes widened. Now, that was very suspicious. That means Jenny was right? Nick asked. Wintour nodded. Most likely. I think Riker is a Spectre. Nick became excited when he heard that. Don't get excited just yet, Wintour said with a serious expression. Nick looked with a raised eyebrow at Wintour. Based on how long he has operated in the Dregs and how far his social power has grown, I'm quite certain of one thing. Riker is not a hatchling. He's an adolescent. That means we can't go after him just yet. Chapter 61, Ability Advancement. An adolescent? Nick repeated. Wintour nodded. I am not entirely sure how he gains more power, but based on his behavior in the past, I would say that he becomes stronger by causing others fear or by just doing horrible things. I'm not sure about the specifics. Riker has been in the Dregs for quite a while, and by now, he has amassed a gang with over 50 members. He has probably caused an incredible amount of grief, which should have given him a lot of power. I doubt very much that he's a hatchling. Nick looked with worry at Wintour. Could he be an adult Spectre? He asked. Wintour shook his head. Very unlikely. It takes a lot for a Spectre to grow. We have been feeding the Dreamer 24/7s, and after months, it's still only advanced by 1.5 levels. If we keep going at this rate, it will probably take 3 years or so to turn the Dreamer into an adult Spectre. And that's considering that we keep feeding him with powerful Zephix extractors. Nick, you have to keep in mind that something stronger also produces much more Zephix. For example, if we keep sending in newbie extractors while the Dreamer is an adolescent, it would take over 15 years for it to become an adult. While Riker has a great reach, a lot of his terror is spread over his gang, and I don't think that suffering by proxy gives as much Zephix as directly inflicting the suffering. At most, Riker is a late adolescent, and I'm already very generous with that evaluation. Most likely he's an early or mid-adolescent, Wintour explained. Nick just furrowed his brows. And we don't have a shot at taking him? Wintour shook his head. Since the difference between realms is a twofold increase in power, and since Riker is most likely an early adolescent, his physical power would be about 5 times as much as you, and that's only considering his physical power. He most likely also has an ability that is very useful in combat, which would make it extremely difficult to deal with him. Even if you could keep your ability perpetually active, you would most likely lose. Nick could only sigh when he heard that. So, we don't go after Riker just yet, Nick said. We don't, Wintour repeated. But then what? Nick asked. We are out of ideas now. That's how all the Zephix manufacturers feel. Wintour told Nick, getting the Spectres is always the most difficult part. Nick could only sigh. Guess that means that I have to go out and find a Spectre again. Sadly, yes, Wintour said. We are still lacking the funds to create a full team of investigators. Nick sighed once again. Okay, he said. I'll do my best and look for a specter, but I'm honestly not sure where I can find one. Wintour nodded. This time, our survival isn't dependent on your rapid success. Even if you don't find one immediately, we are still earning money with the Dreamer. If there is a deadline, it will most likely be when you're about to become a level 2 extractor. But that should still take a bit more than a year or two, Wintour said. You mean the ability advancement? Nick asked. Wintour nodded. I guess you're right, Nick said. I don't think the Dreamer would advance my ability in a very useful or meaningful way. What made the advancements between stages different from advancements between levels? Why was a peak level 1 Zephix extractor becoming an initial level 2 Zephix extractor far more meaningful than an initial level 2 Zephix extractor becoming an early level 2 Zephix extractor? Two reasons. First, the increase in power was twofold instead of 1.5-fold. But more importantly, the ability of the person also advanced. By absorbing Zephix, the extractor's Zephix synchronizer would also become bigger, and eventually it would become big enough to support a stronger ability. When one was ready to reach the next stage, one's Zephix synchronizer would regain the ability to synchronize with a specter. But this new synchronization was different from the first one. During the initial synchronization, the extractor's Zephix synchronizer would try to fully copy the specter's ability. But during the second synchronization, the Zephix synchronizer would combine the new ability with the old one, creating a new one. For example, Wintour had the ability of the blinding light, and if he were to advance by attuning his Zephix synchronizer with the Dreamer, Wintour's ability would transform. Maybe Wintour's light would also cause hallucinations. Maybe Wintour's light would make its targets tired. Maybe Wintour would gain the ability to read the thoughts of his enemy while his ability was active. No matter what case were true, Wintour's initial ability would remain the dominant one, and the Dreamer's ability would need to somehow fit into Wintour's initial ability. Naturally, there were very compatible abilities and very incompatible ones. For example, Wintour's ability and the Dreamer's ability were not compatible at all. One of them dealt with bright light and very noticeable attacks, while the other one was a very covert ability that relied on the element of surprise. So, what if Nick used the Dreamer to advance his ability? Well, in a certain way, the Dreamer's ability was quite compatible with Nick's ability since both of them used the element of surprise. However, they differed very much in how they were used. Nick's ability wanted to kill the enemy, while the Dreamer's ability wanted to manipulate or spy on them. Even more, both abilities would only be able to unleash their powers with the element of surprise, but became useless after that. That was not what Nick wanted. The ability advancement was the best way to transform Nick's ability into one that could be used more than once in a battle, and the Dreamer's ability wouldn't help Nick in achieving that. Because of that, Nick needed another specter. And that was why the deadline for capturing the next specter was Nick's advancement to the second level, which would take 1 to 2 years. Chapter 62 Competition. After talking with Wintour for a bit more, Nick left the warehouse. Nick had already finished his session with the Dreamer today, and since he didn't need to interview any new applicants, he decided to fully focus on finding the next specter. However, that was easier said than done. Just like the last time, Nick had no idea where to find one. And this time, he probably wouldn't get saved by an inspector who wanted to help the general public. At least he had a lot of time. For the first time in quite a while, Nick returned to the dregs. He hadn't been here ever since. He had gotten some food for Horua after Nick had caught the Dreamer. As Nick entered the dregs, everyone threw glances at him. Naturally, Nick was required to wear his Zephix extractor uniform, which was why everyone was looking at him. The red and black colors on the high-quality uniform made him stick out like a sore thumb among the poor denizens of the dregs. Did anything unnatural happen lately? Nick asked one of the people looking at him from the side of the road. The young man with black hair just looked back at Nick with surprise. You mean besides the appearance of a Zephix extractor? The man asked. No, not really. Nick nodded. I belong to Dark Dream, a new Zephix manufacturer, and I have already dealt with a specter that was living in the dregs that was too troublesome for the other manufacturers. Please, tell me if there is anything suspicious that the inspectors told you not to worry about. The man blinked a couple of times in surprise and started to scratch the back of his head in thought. For about 5 seconds, he remained silent. "I don't think I got anything of importance," the man said with an uncertain expression. Nick furrowed his brows. "Are you sure? You don't seem sure." The man looked a bit uncomfortable. "Well, there's something, but I really don't think it's the doing of a specter." Nick's gaze became solemn. "Tell me." The man looked even more uncomfortable. "You sure?" he asked. "I'm sure," Nick said seriously. "Well," the man said, "I've had diarrhea for the last week, but I didn't change my diet." Silence. "And?" Nick asked. "That's it," the man said. Nick's excitement vanished, and he just looked at the man with a deadpan expression. "Have you tried the rust lick?" Nick asked. The man scratched the back of his head. "Yeah, I think that might solve the issue." "Thanks," he said. Nick released a sigh but nodded nevertheless. "If anything pops up, tell me," he said. "Of course," the man answered. Nick just turned around and walked away. He wasn't very bothered or angry. Back when he had been searching for the dreamer, he had had conversations like this all the time. Life in the dregs was horrendous, and many times people just took a specter's doing as natural. A specter's actions were horrible, and the life in the dregs was horrible. So, what was the difference? That was why people in the dregs often overlooked signs of specters. Since life was so shit here, people expected to have nightmares, which was why no one noticed the dreamer. Since there were cruel criminals everywhere, people expected there to be horrible people, which was why no one noticed that Riker was most likely a specter. The specters perfectly blended into the dregs, which was why it was so difficult to find them here. Sadly, the outer city and inner city were completely free of specters, since all the powerful manufacturers paid special attention to these places. Whether he liked it or not, Nick needed to find a specter in the dregs. Nick kept talking to more people, but just like the last time, he found no clues. At least this time, the inspectors weren't making fun of him. Instead, the inspectors refused to talk to Nick besides superfluous and polite small talk. Nick now officially belonged to the competition. Every 2 hours, Nick went back to the hotel to check up on Horua. But these were his only breaks. For the remaining time, Nick kept wandering through the dregs while talking to people. When the day was over, Nick went to bed. The next day, he worked with the dreamer again, talked to Wintor a bit, and went back to searching. This was how the next week passed. For over a week, Nick had been searching for a clue, but he just couldn't find one. By now, Nick had heard about all the mundane issues of the people, but none of them pointed towards a specter. Another week passed. Bang! As Nick walked through the dregs, he suddenly heard the sound of a loud explosion, followed by the sound of something big collapsing. Nick noticed that a big building in the distance had collapsed, and he immediately charged into a small alley at the side. As soon as Nick entered the alley, his ability activated, and with one swift jump, Nick landed on top of a house. Bang! The metal below Nick's feet bent as he charged forward with all of his power. Within 20 seconds, Nick reached the building. Yet, he didn't like what he was seeing at this moment. Right now, there were 3 people standing in front of a big pile of metallic rubble. The person at the front was currently holding something in his hand that looked like a small worm with several tentacles growing from its mouth. Nick was 95% sure that this thing was a specter. However, Nick was also sure that he wouldn't get it. After all, the 3 people in front of the pile of rubble wore Zephix extractor uniforms. Nick could only sigh. "You're late," the leader said, turning to Nick, who was still on the roof of a building. Nick was quite surprised that the extractor had noticed him. "Good luck next time," the leader said with a laugh. Then, he left with his 2 colleagues and the specter. Chapter 63, Sound. Nick sighed. "That's one less specter I can catch," he thought. Naturally, Nick wasn't the only person searching for specters in the dregs, which made things that much more difficult for him. More days passed. Eventually, Nick found a clue. A small family told Nick that there were scary things happening in their house. From time to time, stuff moved around, and they even heard stuff shaking in other rooms. Some of them even claimed that they heard voices coming from below them, which couldn't be possible since the sewers were directly below them. Nick followed up on the clue and entered their house. After staying in their house for a while, Nick suddenly felt his ability deactivate. even though no one was in the room with him. But then, his ability activated again a couple of seconds later. Nick furrowed his brows and took a step forward in the empty room. His ability deactivated again. 3 seconds later, it reactivated. Nick knew what that meant. Someone is hearing me but can't see me, he thought. Since Nick's ability deactivated if anyone sensed him, it also meant that it deactivated when someone heard him make a sound. At that moment, the person or specter knew where Nick was, since they knew where the sound came from. But if they didn't see Nick, and if Nick didn't give off more sounds, they wouldn't be able to perceive him again. After all, Nick could have already walked away from the spot where the sound had been made, making it uncertain for the listener whether he was there or not. They can hear me but not see me, Nick thought. This either means that the specter is blind or that it is not inside the room. Nick very silently took a step to the side. His ability didn't deactivate. Then, Nick quietly opened a door. Usually houses in the dregs didn't have any doors, but this one did. When Nick was slowly opening the door, his ability didn't deactivate. That means the specter is also not in that room, Nick thought, looking at the door he was opening. The next moment, Nick took a couple of normal steps. His ability deactivated again. 3 seconds later, it reactivated. After that, Nick silently crept over to another door and quietly opened it. His ability didn't deactivate, means it is also not in that room, Nick thought. Nick scratched his chin. These are the only 2 adjacent rooms. The next moment, Nick grabbed an uneven spot on one of the metallic walls and pulled himself up. Ding, ding. Nick quietly knocked on the ceiling of the room. His ability didn't deactivate. Ding, ding. Nick used some more power. His ability didn't deactivate. Ding. Now it deactivated, means the specter is not above me as well. That knock was so loud that every adjacent room heard it, Nick thought. Then, Nick walked to one of the walls and quietly knocked at it. The same thing happened, and Nick's ability only deactivated after a pretty strong knock. After that, Nick tried the other wall. Same thing. That only leaves one spot, Nick thought as he looked at the floor. Slowly, Nick went to his knees, and then he quietly knocked on the floor. Ding. Nick's ability immediately deactivated. Nick narrowed his eyes. In the sewers, huh? The next moment, Nick went to the rusty wall again and climbed it a bit. After that, Nick put his feet on the wall and looked at the ground. His ability had become active again. Boom! Nick shot at the ground, and as soon as he hit it, the metallic plates broke apart. The rusty plates couldn't possibly resist such a tremendous shockwave. As the entire floor collapsed, Nick's ability didn't deactivate, surprisingly. Although that was actually logical after all, with sounds of collapsing metal plates coming from everywhere. No one could tell where Nick was just based on sound. As the floor was collapsing, Nick rapidly took out a tube and destroyed it. Whoom! A bright domain of arc light appeared, encompassing the falling metallic plates. The dark sewer lit up, and Nick quickly found something that wasn't supposed to be there. Just 2 meters below where the old floor had been, was some kind of scaffolding made of pieces of rusty metal. And then, Nick saw something else. There was someone on the piece of scaffolding. It was a middle-aged man, and he was in the process of ducking, which was quite understandable since the ceiling above him had just exploded. Bang! One of Nick's legs kicked one of the falling metal plates, shooting him towards the guy. Crack! Nick's elbow hit the guy's chest and pushed him toward the scaffolding, which broke apart as well. When Nick's elbow had hit the guy, he had felt many of his bones break, which told him one thing. That's a human, Nick thought. Sure. Nick had shot at the guy with quite a bit of power, but a specter wouldn't get injured this heavily as long as it wasn't an initial hatchling. Nick had just caused a genuinely life-threatening injury, which wouldn't have happened if this were a specter. Nick gritted his teeth in frustration. You idiot, Nick thought as he jumped away from the breaking scaffolding. The fact that Nick's ability hadn't deactivated meant that the guy was not able to perceive any other person right now. The guy probably couldn't muster the mental capacity for proper spatial awareness after having his chest caved in, which meant that he didn't know where Nick was. Nick grabbed one of the pieces of scaffolding that didn't break and threw himself back into the room at the top. Not all the plates had collapsed. As soon as Nick landed, he looked into the sewers. Splash. Several metal plates fell into the sewers, as well as the guy. Yeah, that guy is not surviving, Nick thought. The next moment, Nick just snorted in annoyance. What the fuck were you even doing down there? There are enough houses for everyone. Why would you live below someone else's house? Nick just kept looking into the sewers, which had calmed down by now. 10 seconds passed. Guess he lost consciousness. I am not a fan of killing people, but I'm not going to mourn a dumb fuck like that. Chapter 64, Profiting. Why was he even here? Like, did he live here? Nick thought. Probably not. That scaffolding was quite rickety and not very big. But then what the fuck was that guy doing below this house? I mean, the tenants said that spooky things were happening in their house, which was most likely his doing. But why? I mean, did he do it on purpose? Based on what the tenants said, it had to have been on purpose. This means this guy was down here for a reason, and I don't think it's a very honest and nice one. In the end, Nick could only sigh. I guess the answer died with him. Splash, splash, splash. The next moment, Nick saw and heard several things entering the water. Nick raised an eyebrow when he saw a couple of rats swimming towards the place where the guy had fallen into the sewers. Thanks, Nick. Nick moved his head over the edge and looked at where the voice had come from. A rat was clinging to the ceiling, looking at him from about 2 meters away. 9 more of those, and I'll tell you where you can find a weak specter, the rat said with a smirk. Nick furrowed his brows and didn't answer. Oh, come on, the rat said. You've killed for less. A memory shot through Nick's mind, and an annoyed expression appeared on his face. Under normal circumstances, Nick would say that he would never consider the parasite's offer. However, he had been searching for a specter for 3 weeks now, and the latest clue had turned out to be just some random dude. Nick was quite frustrated and annoyed. For about 10 seconds, he didn't say anything. Meanwhile, the color of the sewers below Nick had turned a bit redder. I'll consider it, Nick said. Great, the rat said, excitedly clapping its little hands while keeping itself clinging to the ceiling with its hind legs. I'm looking forward to it. Just throw them in the sewers. Nick snorted. Why was that guy even here? Nick asked. He was a stalker, the rat said. A stalker? Nick repeated. Yep, he kept rambling on and on about the love of his life, and how he would make everyone leave the house so that he could be with her, the rat said. Total nutjob. Huh? Nick uttered in something that was and wasn't surprise at the same time. The next moment, Nick pulled his head out of the sewers again and stood up. Nick exited the room and walked out of the house. After exiting, Nick saw 2 people waiting for him. One of them was a middle-aged man, and the other was a 14-year-old girl. The man was quite muscular and burly, and based on the things he was wearing, Nick could tell that he was someone working for the peddlers, one of the 4 big gangs. Those 2 were the inhabitants of the house. Nick's eyes fell on the young girl. I guess that was his target, Nick thought. The next moment, Nick looked at the man, and with her father present, the stalker didn't dare to directly do anything to her. Guess killing someone isn't always bad. The burly man quickly came up to Nick with a nervous and scared expression. Surprisingly, his daughter didn't seem as anxious as her father. We just heard a loud bang, the father said. Did you find the specter? Daddy, it's not a specter, the daughter said with a groan. If it were, we would already be dead. Let Daddy talk with the extractor, honey, the father said as he lightly patted his daughter's head. The daughter just snorted and looked to the side, but she didn't escape from her father's head pats. So? The father asked, looking at Nick. It was a guy, Nick said. A guy? The father repeated in shock. Told you it wasn't a specter, the daughter said with a prideful smirk. Nick nodded. Some guy built some kind of scaffolding in the sewers below your house. When I knew that someone or something was below your house, I broke through your floor and found him. Many memories shot through the father's mind, and his fear and anxiety were very quickly replaced with pure rage. Some random guy was living below his house and causing him so much worry. Where is he? The father asked with a dark tone. His scaffolding broke, and he fell into the sewers, Nick said. The parasite quickly took care of him. The man snorted with aggression. Lucky bastard, he grumbled. Anyway, I have to thank you, sir, the man said with a respectful tone. Without you, I would have probably lost my home. Nick nodded with a neutral expression. If you ever find any information regarding any possible specters, please contact us. If you actually find one, you will have helped us far more than I have helped you today. Of course, the man said, hitting his chest once to emphasize that he was serious. I will tell my men to keep an eye out. Nick nodded again. Good. By the way, you should fix the floor in one of your living rooms. That's not a problem, sir, the man said with a laugh. Thank you again. The next moment, the man pushed his daughter forward a bit. Say thanks to the nice man, honey. The girl furrowed her brows, but her expression quickly turned into a friendly smile before politely bowing to Nick. Thank you so much, sir. Nick nodded one last time and walked away. Some seconds later, Nick just sighed. And the search continues, he thought with annoyance. 3 weeks. 3 fucking weeks. How long until I can finally get some clues for a specter? As Nick walked, his short conversation with the parasite shot through his mind. Nick walked in silence. 9 more corpses, huh? Nick looked at the sky with a thoughtful expression. Is it really that bad? I mean, there are plenty of people that deserve to die, right? Is it so bad that I profit from these deaths? Nick wasn't sure. Chapter 65. So difficult. Another 2 weeks passed. By now, Nick had been searching for a specter for around 6 weeks. And still, he had not gotten a single clue. There had been a couple of leads, but none of them actually led to a real specter. It was always just humans. Sure enough, the last time I was lucky. Nick thought with a sigh while taking a break in the marketplace. Even more, there was this second group of extractors that found a specter in the dregs. I feel like the other manufacturers find so many more specters than me. Although, I get it. They have investigators, while we don't have anything. How are we supposed to keep up with that? In fact, I didn't even find the specter myself last time. An inspector actually told me about the dreamer. Can I even find any specter on my own? Nick sighed again. 6 weeks with no leads. Nick looked at the people that were passing by him. By now, the people no longer avoided him. They had grown used to Nick's presence. At least I've gotten plenty of experience in how to find specters. I know which clues will most likely not produce any result, and I know how to get people to talk. On top of that, I learned a lot about what other people in the dregs do when nobody's around. And I even learned how the gangs operate internally. If there were any clues, I would probably be able to get them. Nick sighed once more. However, barely a day passes before one of the inspectors already finds the clue, and with their manpower, they can get to the bottom of the clue in no time. All the inspectors meet every day and gather their relevant information, making it much easier to create a full image of the dregs. Meanwhile, I can only look at a small part of the dregs every day since I am alone. I really need a team of inspectors. Nick just kept thinking about his current situation in frustration and hopelessness. He had no idea how to get another specter. Stop, please. Nick's eyes slowly moved to the marketplace. You don't want to have some fun. Come on, don't be such a prude. No, go away, please. You can have my money. You can keep your money. I want something else. Nick just sighed. Another rape. In the outer city, sexual assault was illegal, but nobody really cared about this in the dregs. In a certain way, it might even secretly be encouraged since it produced more children, which produced more blood for Kugelblitz. Of course, nobody actually said that it was encouraged. But the absence of prosecutions for rapists still counted as a statement from the city. Rapes happened almost every day. It was a very common sight in the dregs. Everyone had gotten used to them, and the people just avoided the situation in the center of the marketplace. Right now, a younger woman was being beset by 2 guys. One of the guys was holding the woman's shoulder while the other one was grabbing his dick through his pants with a smirk. Nick had witnessed quite a lot of these events. Stop! This is my last warning. I will bite your dick off, the woman shouted as the guy was unbuttoning his pants. Oh, we got a feisty one, eh? The other guy said, his pants apparently having gotten a bit tighter around the waist. Do you dare? The first guy said as he pulled the woman's head down. If you make me bleed, you will lose 2 liters of your blood. Can you afford that? The woman wrestled against her captor's hands, but she wasn't strong enough. "You already look anemic," the other guy said, slowly moving his finger across the woman's very white skin. "If you lose another 2 liters of blood, you will most likely die. Are you so against having a bit of fun with us? We are even willing to pay you 5 credits each." The woman gritted her teeth in anger, frustration, hatred, and helplessness. The people in the marketplace avoided her. If these 2 men were just random people, some of the others might have gotten involved. However, these 2 guys had the insignia of the Riker strikers. While some of the bystanders were willing to put themselves in a bit of danger for their morals, they were not willing to commit suicide for them. After a bit more persuasion, the sexual assault commenced. Nick had grown so cold and apathetic to these events that he just absent-mindedly watched the woman's head bop back and forth on the guy's crotch, in the middle of the marketplace. As Nick watched, a memory shot through his mind. He remembered his conversation with that one investigator who told Nick about the Dreamer. Back then, Nick had been furious with the Zephyx manufacturer because they didn't do anything against the Dreamer, even though they had the power and knew about it. They were willing to just sit by and let the people suffer. Nick had been absolutely furious with them back then. Wasn't he doing something very similar just now? "I have the power to stop this," Nick thought, watching the crying woman. But would that change anything? They are the Riker strikers, and they are known for going against absolutely everyone that resists them. Sure, I don't need to fear them. But that just means that they will focus their anger all on that girl. At that point, they will probably steal all her belongings and rape her a couple more times before dooming her to die during the next tax day. Intervening now would only make things worse for her. If I'm going to interfere, her life is my responsibility since I would have indirectly killed her. The next moment, Nick looked at the guy who was pushing his cock into the crying girl's face. "And if I kill them, I have to pay 5,000 credits per person." Sure, they wouldn't seek revenge on the girl anymore, but 5,000 credits is still a lot. I would have lost 10,000 credits just to save someone I don't even know. Even more, I wouldn't even get to keep the corpses, or I would need to pay another 10,000 credits per person, which means I also can't give them to the parasite. Nick sighed. Why is being a good guy so difficult? Chapter 66, Exchange. Nick kept watching the event in the middle of the marketplace. Usually, Nick didn't like watching something like this, but since Nick's current moral dilemma was related to this event, he just kept absent-mindedly watching. One of the 2 guys had noticed that Nick kept watching like a creep and became a bit embarrassed. Is he a voyeur? The guy that was currently in the process of having intercourse in public thought. Usually one of them would charge at Nick and kick him a couple of times, but Nick's uniform stopped these thoughts from even occurring. Zephyx extractors were the absolutely worst people one could attack. Not only did they have an incredibly high status, but they could also tear humans apart like paper. 30,000 credits if I want to keep the 2 corpses, Nick thought as he looked at the 2 men. The guy on the side felt a cold shudder go down his neck as his dick became limp. Don't tell me that guy is gay. Nick just kept looking, deep in thought. 9 corpses would come to 135,000 credits, Nick thought. For 135,000 credits, I can find the location of a specter immediately. That's all I have to pay. Nick didn't even see killing these 2 men as part of the deal, since that didn't have any relevance to him. Sure, Nick wasn't a big fan of killing, but if Nick really didn't like someone, that someone lost all their value in Nick's eyes. He had seen too much shit in the dregs to care about these people. Ah, there we go, the other guy shouted with a satisfied voice as he pulled himself out of the girl's mouth. By now, the girl was full-on crying and fell backward with closed eyes. "I think this isn't her first time," the guy said to his friend. "She's surprisingly good at this. She does this amazing thing with her tongue." "Yeah, I'm not interested," the other guy said as he looked at Nick with a concerned expression. "I'm not in the mood." "Not in the mood?" the first guy asked in surprise. "But you said you are into this sort of thing. I made you my rape buddy exactly because you were so into this shit. Don't tell me you've gotten soft." The other guy snorted. "I got soft, but not in that department," the guy said. The next moment, he gestured to Nick with a movement of his head. "He's watching, and it kind of ruined the mood for me." The first guy looked at Nick, and when he saw Nick's uniform, he also became a bit concerned. "Why does he keep looking at us?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," the other guy answered. "Think he's gay?" "No idea, dude." "How long has he been looking?" "Since the start." The guy felt himself become a bit red in the face when he thought that a Zephyx extractor had been watching him rape a girl. He didn't mind the other people since he was very much into being perceived as powerful. When these weak people watched him without doing anything, he felt like he was establishing his dominance over all of the dregs. But when it was a Zephyx extractor, things were very different since he knew very well that he couldn't possibly compete with one of those. Because of that, he became quite a bit embarrassed. "I get it," the guy said, understanding why the other one wasn't in the mood. "Give me my money." The two of them looked at the crying girl. By now she had opened her eyes and she was glaring with hatred at the guy that had just raped her. When the guy saw the girl's aggressive expression, he became a bit angry and annoyed. He didn't like it when his prey bit back. Nevertheless, he took out 5 credits and threw them at the girl without saying anything. To the two of them, it was important to keep the good prey alive, so that they could be reused, which was why they were paying them. At least the really good ones. The bad ones didn't get paid. The next moment, the two of them walked away from the marketplace. Nick just kept sitting at the side of the marketplace, still thinking about his options. How much longer? How much longer do I have to search for a Spectre? Also, just because I can't go against Riker himself yet, doesn't mean that I can't get rid of some of his people. After all, I'm a Zephyx extractor, and Riker won't risk exposing himself by trying to take revenge on me. The death of a Zephyx extractor is a huge deal. In a way, I can make the dregs a better place while also profiting from it. 135,000 credits in exchange for the location of a Spectre and a better world. Nick nodded and stood up. Then, he left the marketplace and walked towards the outer city. For the next hour, Nick talked to Wintor inside his office. Some hours later, Nick went to sleep. When he woke up, he dealt with Horua and worked with the Dreamer. After that, Nick left Dark Dream and entered a station where the guards of Crimson Fungus City worked. It was a black building with a huge symbol of Crimson Fungus City on it. As soon as he entered, the guards turned to Nick, and when they saw his uniform, they became interested. One of the officers walked over to Nick. "Welcome. Is there anything we can help you with?" Nick nodded. "My Zephyx manufacturer requires some specific corpses from the dregs. I will be the one doing the killing and collecting. You just need to officiate the proceedings and help me transport the corpses," Nick said. Surprisingly, the guard just smiled politely. He wasn't surprised or shocked at all. "Of course," the officer said. "Please leave your company's card here for reference." Nick nodded and took out Dark Dream's official bank card. The officer smiled politely, put the card away, and called a team of 3 guards. 2 of the guards came over to Nick and introduced themselves politely, while the last one walked to the back. Some seconds later, the guy came back out, pulling a hearse. "Where to?" the guy asked. "The dregs," Nick answered. Chapter 67, Scary. Nick walked towards the dregs while 3 of the guards kept following him. 2 of the guards were rather tall and wore black uniforms, similar to the uniforms of the tax collectors, but without the gas masks. The entire gas mask thing for the tax collectors mainly existed to keep their identities secret, and so that they didn't need to smell the disgusting dregs. Normal guards didn't wear gas masks, but right now they wish they did. As soon as they walked into the dregs, the faces of the 2 guards behind Nick scrunched up, while the 3rd guard far behind them just sneered in disgust. The outer city had a solid wall of metal between itself and the sewers, but the dregs were mostly built on rusty grates. One could imagine how bad it smelled to walk over something like the sewers of Crimson Fungus City. As soon as they entered, the eyes of the people opened widely in horror. If there were simply a couple of guards with a Zephyx extractor, they wouldn't care. However, the hearse was what scared them. The people immediately scattered, not even entering the houses, but just running as far away as possible. The guards just casually watched the people scatter. The Zephyx extractor had said that he would be the one creating the corpses. "Want us to stop them?" one of the guards asked as a formality. "No," Nick answered neutrally. "As you wish," the guard answered before becoming quiet again. As Nick walked through the dregs, he felt strange. At this moment, he no longer felt like a member of the dregs. In fact, he felt like one of the tax collectors. For some reason, Nick felt like he was not looking at humans running from him, but at animals. This feeling scared him. He felt like he was losing something important, and he quickly shook his head. "Stop thinking about these things," Nick thought with frustration. "You're about to make this a better place. You're about to take care of some people from the Riker strikers. The people are running from you only because they don't trust you and don't know if you will kill them. If they knew what you were doing, they would look at you with thankful eyes." However, it wasn't easy to get rid of this strange feeling. Even though Nick knew that what he was doing was for the good of the dregs, he still felt like some kind of monster. Eventually, the four of them reached the marketplace. It was empty. Naturally, everyone had already heard about the group of people coming, and they had already scattered like roaches. It didn't matter what power one had in the dregs. Children, adults, merchants, rapists, murderers, gang members, or whatever. Everyone was equally helpless when the guards or Zephix extractors came. Nick led the three guards past the marketplace into a relatively small alleyway. The alleyway was so small that the hearse didn't even fit into it. "You can leave it here," Nick said, turning to the guy pulling the hearse. The guard just nodded and waited at the entrance of the alleyway with his hearse. A moment later, he took out a small azure bottle. "Really, Johnny?" one of the guards asked with annoyance. "We're working right now." The guard gritted his teeth and put the bottle into his pockets again. "Sorry, boss." "Johnny, you really need to keep this addiction under control. I don't want your performance to suffer." "Don't worry, boss. I know. Sorry," the guard said. The other guards sighed and turned to Nick. "Sorry for this. It's fine," Nick said, as he led the two guards deeper into the alleyway. When they were gone, Johnny took out the azure bottle again and unplugged it. The next moment, he bit down on a part of his lower lip so hard that it started bleeding. Then, he put one of his fingers into the bottle and carefully took out some blue dust, which he then placed on the bleeding part of his lip. His body started to shake in place, and a pained expression appeared on Johnny's face. Yet, there was also deep happiness visible on his face. A minute later, he stopped shaking. CRKSH. He bit his lip again and put another bit of blue dust on it. Meanwhile, Nick led the two guards behind him to an unnoticeable wall of a seemingly random building. Nick pushed on it a bit, but it didn't move. This was the entrance to the Riker Strikers' headquarters. Naturally, after gathering information in the dregs for over 6 weeks, Nick had learned where the headquarters of all the different gangs were. "Locked," Nick thought emotionlessly. "Step back," Nick said. The two guards took a couple of steps back. "Turn around. I don't want to show you my ability," Nick added. The two guards looked at each other but turned around after. There was no reason for Nick to kill them. After staying silent for a couple of seconds, Nick felt his ability activate. Since Nick was a late newbie, his body was about 3.4 times as powerful as the average human male, and with his ability active, it was around 17 times as powerful. If he wanted, Nick could lift a stone that weighed over a ton over his head. But instead, Nick grabbed the side of the plate and pulled with all his power. Kirk. The screws and nails exploded off the plate, and the plate was thrown to the side. The sound was extremely violent and loud, and when the guards heard it, their entire bodies jerked in shock. It sounded like something huge had just broken through a metallic wall. The two of them quickly turned around, but they just saw Nick standing in front of an open corridor. When the two of them saw the many small holes in the wall and the bent metallic plate on the side, they took deep breaths through their teeth. They couldn't do something like that. Even though they were guards, they were still just humans. Once more, they were reminded of how scary Zephix extractors were. Chapter 68, Creating Corpses. Nick just gestured towards the open corridor with his head and entered. The two guards took another deep breath and followed him. Luckily, the Zephix extractor was not their enemy. Shortly after entering, two tall men walked out of one of the doors at the side of the corridor. Based on their lack of clothing, Nick could tell that they had probably been asleep until now. "What the f? Bang!" Before the first guy could finish speaking, Nick casually extended his hand to his face and shoved his head into the metallic wall. Crack! The loud sound of something hard cracking echoed throughout the corridor, and the other guy's eyes widened in terror. He immediately took out a long metallic pipe and lifted it in front of him in terror. Nick quickly arrived in front of him and grabbed the pipe. The man felt like a giant was pushing the pipe to the side. The next moment, Nick grabbed the guy's shoulder and shoved him to the ground. The man couldn't even resist. The man was quite big and powerful by the Dreg's standards, which meant he was about 85 kilos with a low body fat percentage. That put him at a bit above average for normal human standards. And Nick? Well, if one were to use the guy as a reference, Nick would be a man weighing about 240 kilos with a low body fat percentage. That was an amount of muscle that nearly no normal human had ever accomplished in their life. Maybe after a lifetime of brutal training while being over 210 centimeters tall. And yet all of that power was condensed into a frame that was barely 175 centimeters tall. Without thinking much about it, being 3.4 times as powerful as an average man didn't seem that impressive, but when put into actual numbers, it was actually a terrifying amount of power. As soon as the man was pushed to the ground, Nick grabbed the man's head and twisted it until he heard several violent cracks. Nick wasn't used to killing people, but he knew that he just needed to create enough cracks at important places to kill someone. Nick grabbed one of the guys and casually threw the body towards the entrance. The two guards sidestepped the body as they looked at it with lifted eyebrows. "Keep an eye on them," Nick said. Sure," one of them said absent-mindedly as he kept looking at the body beside his feet. Nick nodded and went into one of the rooms where one of the guys had come out. Inside, Nick saw a couple of bunk beds. On one of the beds, Nick saw a guy rubbing his head in annoyance before looking towards the door. Nick walked towards the bunk bed as the eyes of the guy followed him in confusion. With a jump, Nick jumped on top of the bunk bed, his two hands surrounding the guy's neck. Then, Nick felt several pops with his hands as the man's expression became terrified. The man's hands and feet tried to punch and kick Nick, but the man felt like he was hitting a wall. In a last-ditch effort, the man tried to reach for Nick's eyes, but Nick just moved his head out of the way until the guy went limp. Just to make sure, Nick twisted the head of the guy until there was nearly no resistance anymore. Killing someone wasn't difficult if one had a lot of physical strength. Then, Nick heard some clamoring and saw someone jump out of one of the beds, bolting for the door. Bang! The bunk bed Nick was kneeling on exploded as he shot toward the person. The man barely managed to get out of the door before Nick managed to grab his arm, at which point the guy was pulled back into the room. Again, Nick just bent the guy's head until it lost its connection to the neck. Since there was no one else running away, Nick threw the two bodies to the entrance under the interested gazes of the two guards. Next, Nick went back into the room and looked at it more closely. No, please. Bang. When Nick opened one of the closets, he found a man cowering and screaming in it. A kick to the face silenced him quickly. To make sure, Nick cracked the neck of the guy a bit. That had been the last person in the room. After throwing that corpse onto the other corpses, Nick entered another room. This room also had 3 bunk beds, but Nick saw nobody in them. He looked around a bit and didn't see any other exit out of the room. Crack! Nick closed the door and bent the door hinge until the door couldn't be opened anymore. Then, he began to search the room. He found a guy under a bed. A kick and a crack silenced him. When Nick opened one of the closets again, he saw a terrified man cowering on the ground. Surprisingly, the man neither moved nor screamed. He was just looking at Nick with widely opened eyes. Nick slowly moved his hand towards the guy's head as he watched Nick in terror. Bang! After ramming the guy's head on the side of the closet, Nick separated the neck from its skull again to make sure. A minute later, Nick finished looking through the room. There was nobody else. But then, Nick furrowed his brows. Right now, Nick silently stood in the middle of the room, yet his ability hadn't reactivated. Nick moved around the room a bit and stopped for 3 seconds at seemingly random locations. Sometimes Nick's ability reactivated before deactivating again. Eventually, Nick looked up. There was a rusty grate above him. Nick jumped up, grabbed the grate and pulled it out of the ceiling. Immediately, Nick heard frantic sounds coming from above him. When Nick's head entered the new hole in the ceiling, he saw a guy trying to crawl away in some kind of ventilation shaft. After going into the shaft, Nick grabbed the man's feet and pulled him back. Ah, help me. The man's nails broke off as he desperately tried to stop himself from getting pulled backward, leaving bloody lines on the walls. Some seconds later, the door to the room exploded and Nick threw the corpses into the corridor. The guards looked at the corpses with neutral expressions and pulled them to the other ones. "I need one more," Nick said neutrally before going deeper into the hideout. Chapter 69, Right Thing. A minute later, the body of a young man was thrown onto the corpse pile by Nick. "All right, I'm done," Nick said as he released a sigh. The leading guard nodded. "You want to keep the corpses, right?" he asked. Nick wordlessly nodded. "All right, we'll put them on the hearse and calculate the price back in the outpost," he said. Nick nodded again as he walked past them. When Nick exited the corridor, he looked back. He saw one of the guards putting one of the corpses on the shoulders of the other guard, but Nick wasn't consciously taking note of that. Right now, Nick's thoughts were completely elsewhere. "I did the right thing, right?" Nick thought. "The Riker Strikers are a horrible gang that rape and kill people all the time without contributing anything. The hub brings a lot of jobs and keeps the gangs in check. The peddlers are the reason why there are so many people in the dregs in the first place, since they bring in a huge portion of the food. The insurance gang gives people a way to protect their belongings from others. All of them contribute to the dregs. But the Riker Strikers don't contribute anything. They just steal, rob, rape, and murder." At that moment, one of the guards walked past Nick with one of the corpses on his shoulders. Nick didn't look at the corpse, but he felt like the corpse was looking at him with its widely opened and dead eyes. Nick's mind replayed the things he had seen inside the corridor: screaming people, terrified people, and yet Nick only felt like he had gotten rid of some pests. They obviously were people, but Nick only viewed them as roaches or rats. In a way, these people were even worse than rats and roaches, since those could actually be eaten. Nick felt like he was supposed to feel more. They were still humans, right? Wasn't he supposed to feel something while killing humans? At that point, Nick was reminded of the first time he had killed someone. When Nick was just 13, he had been close to starving, and due to sheer luck, he somehow managed to kill a rat. When Nick had just taken his first bite, a gruff and tall woman pushed him away and grabbed the rat. At that moment, Nick had been filled with panic, and he had used all his power to push the woman when she had turned her back to him. Surprisingly, the woman had been sent flying, and she landed on a very rusty grate, which broke. A moment later, she screamed in terror as she fell into the sewers. The young Nick just looked with terror at the hole in the ground. He didn't dare to look into it. He only heard the sounds of many smaller things also falling into the water and the woman's screams becoming shriller and hoarser. Soon, the screams vanished, and a minute later, a rat walked out of the hole. "Thanks," the rat said with a smirk as it stopped in front of Nick. "You can have this body as a reward. If you ever need food, you can just throw another person into the sewers." And then, the rat just collapsed. The following days had been the most horrible of Nick's life. Sleeping had become extremely difficult. Eating had become difficult. Working had become difficult. Living had become difficult. Nick had been haunted by his memories of that day for weeks. Yet, in a certain way, the memories had helped him. Nick had feared confronting the memories so much that he had become active during every waking moment. He feared the silence that allowed him to think and did everything to avoid it. This resulted in Nick's body becoming stronger and in him getting more money by working more. And eventually, Nick had learned to live with everything. Finally, when Nick had finished his third assassination mission from the hub, he had made his peace with that event. Nick had never been a fan of killing, but he needed money to survive and to build a future, which was why he had accepted these missions. It was something that he simply had to do and get through. Beggars literally couldn't be choosers. "Sir, we're done." Nick was pulled out of his memories as one of the guards called him. He turned to the entrance of the alleyway and saw the hearse completely filled. The next moment, Nick threw one last glance at the entrance of the corridor. "I did the right thing," he told himself in his mind. After shaking his head to regain his bearings, Nick went to the hearse. "Let's return," he said. "Of course, sir," the leading guard said. By now the second guard had joined the third guard in pulling the hearse, since it had become quite a bit heavier. The four of them traveled through the dregs in absolute silence. They didn't speak, and nothing in their vicinity made any noise. It was almost like they were traveling through a ruin. Eventually they entered the outer city. More people appeared on the streets. But when they saw the hearse, they just held their noses and avoided walking near the hearse. A couple minutes later, the four of them arrived at the outpost of the guards. The hearse was parked outside the entrance while the four of them entered. Nick was led into a separate office, and the leading guard took out several sheets of paper. After reading all the sheets of paper and explaining them to Nick, the guard gave Nick a couple of them to sign. Nick signed all of them, and the guard put them away. "And that's all." "Thank you, sir," the guard said with a polite smile. Nick nodded and stood up. "Thank you as well. No thanks necessary. Just doing my job." Nick nodded again and left the office. "Please, bring back the hearse by tomorrow," the leading guard shouted before Nick closed the door. After exiting the outpost, Nick looked at the hearse filled with bodies. Some seconds later, he wordlessly took hold of the hearse and began to pull. Chapter 70: Sustainable Help. As Nick traveled through the outer city, people kept avoiding him due to the hearse he was pulling. A couple of minutes later, Nick arrived in front of Dark Dream's warehouse and entered through one of the big gates. The sound of the rusty wheels echoed throughout the entire warehouse. Just when Nick put the hearse down, the door to Wintour's office opened. It was barely 5 p.m., and Wintour was still here. When Wintour saw the hearse with the leaking blood, he took a deep breath, but he didn't let Nick see it. Even though Wintour had been raised to become a ruthless businessman, seeing a small hill of corpses was still shocking to him. Wintour slowly walked over and stopped 2 meters away from the hearse as Nick stepped to the side. "They are all members of the Riker Strikers?" Wintour asked. Nick nodded. "They were all staying in the headquarters, and they are all pretty muscular and big." Wintour absent-mindedly nodded as he kept looking at the hill. "And you're sure Riker won't take revenge?" "You were the one that assured me he wouldn't," Nick answered. Wintour took another deep breath. "Right, sorry," he answered absent-mindedly before looking away from the hearse. "This is a good thing," Nick said, looking at Wintour. "The Riker Strikers are a plague upon the dregs." "Nick," Wintour said with a slightly annoyed tone, "don't be disingenuous. We killed them for money. Nothing more and nothing less." When Nick heard that, he narrowed his eyes. "Maybe that's true for you, but I genuinely care about the dregs. If the Riker Strikers weren't such a massive nuisance, I would have never killed them." "And then what?" Wintour asked. "Yes, you wouldn't have killed anyone else. But that's only because not enough time has passed." Nick wanted to protest, but he didn't interrupt Wintour. "You've searched for 6 weeks with no results, and you grew desperate. If the Riker Strikers didn't exist, you wouldn't have killed anyone. But what after another 4 weeks, or another 10 weeks? When would you have become desperate and frustrated enough to kill people from another gang?" Wintour asked. "Wintour, you're evaluating me with your standards," Nick answered. "I have killed people before, but only when it was necessary or when there was a good reason. I am richer than 95% of all people living in the outer city, and I am well on my way as a Zephix extractor. Acting like I need to kill someone to survive while having this much wealth is something I can never accept," Nick explained. "And yet, you just killed 9 people," Wintour countered. "Because I finally have the power to make a difference," Nick answered with a dark voice. "I am finally rich and powerful enough to change the lives of others for the better." "Wintour, my goal is not to just become fat and rich, but to improve the lives of the people around me," Nick argued. "Since when?" Nick furrowed his brows. "What do you mean, since when?" "Since when?" Wintour repeated. "When we were on the search for the dreamer, you told me that you just wanted to have a better life. You never said you wanted to improve the lives of the people around you." Silence. Surprisingly, Nick didn't immediately answer. "Since when, huh?" Nick repeated as he looked up with furrowed brows. Wintour didn't interrupt Nick's thoughts. Nick thought back to his 3 days of vacation with Horua. Back then, Nick's goal hadn't been to improve the lives of other people. When Nick had worked with the dreamer, he also hadn't thought about the lives of others. When Nick had been searching for the next specter, he also hadn't thought about others. And yet, I feel like I want to change things, Nick thought. I feel like I should do something to improve the general quality of life of the people in the dregs. When did that happen? Silence. Eventually, Nick reached an answer, but he didn't like it. When I decided to kill the Riker strikers, Nick thought. That was when I made my choice. Nick looked down. Is Wintour right? Am I just saying this because I want a justification? I was growing frustrated, and when the frustration hit a high point, I suddenly found a solution to my frustration while also conveniently finding a moral justification. What if I wouldn't have gained anything out of this? What if I weren't allowed to keep the corpses? Would I still have done this? Silence. Nick kept thinking. As things are now, no. However, that's because of the price for killing them. I want to help the people, but 5,000 credits to kill a person is just too high of a price. If I wouldn't need to pay 5,000 credits for every person I kill, I genuinely believe I would kill the Riker strikers to improve the dregs. Yes, I want to improve the lives of others. I always lamented that so many powerful people didn't give a shit about improving the world and just kept consuming more and more to become fatter and fatter while we poor people suffered. I always wanted to change things, but I never felt like I had the power. But now, I am slowly attaining this power. I refuse to become one of these people who forget their past struggles. I refuse to have this mindset that since I am now the one in power, I have a moral justification to do the same thing that has been done to me in the past to others. I will improve the lives of others. The next moment, Nick narrowed his eyes and looked at the hearse. But it has to be sustainable. If I can't keep my power, I lose the power to help others. The stronger I get, the more people I can help. But it's important that I never lose this mindset. The next moment, Nick turned to Wintour. Thanks, I needed that. Wintour just raised an eyebrow. He wasn't quite sure what Nick meant. Chapter 71, Silent Work. Nick explained what he had been thinking about to Wintour, who just looked at Nick with a skeptical expression. So you're actually serious? Wintour asked. You actually want to improve the lives of the people of the dregs? Nick nodded without hesitation. Why? Wintour asked. They've never done anything for you. From what I've heard, all of them didn't care about you, and many of them even wanted to steal your things. Why would you want to sacrifice the stuff you earned to help people like them? It's the system, not the individual person, Nick said. If there were no taxes, the number of violent crimes would drop significantly. If the people had access to better food, they wouldn't need to fight others for valuable nutrients. Yes, there are many people that are unnecessarily cruel and extremely selfish. Naturally, these people don't deserve to get a better life. But I can't judge all of the poor people, because some of them are monsters. Just like how I can't call all the rich people monsters because they are not helping us. Right now, the people in the dregs suffer, and some of them can improve their lives. However, I want it the other way around. I want everyone to have a good life, and if they do bad stuff, their lives will worsen. I think everyone deserves a chance, and I want to do my best to make this possible. Wintour still looked at Nick with a skeptical expression. That's a tall order, you know. Nick nodded. I know. If I want to help everyone in the dregs on such a fundamental level, I probably need to become as powerful as Albert, at least. Maybe even more powerful. But at least then, my power has actual value and meaning. Wintour rubbed his chin as he looked at Nick. So, in short, you want to become much stronger. Power is the source that allows you to realize your dreams, right? He asked. I guess you could put it like that, Nick said with a nod. All right, Wintour said. The next moment, Wintour sighed. I'm happy to hear that, you know? This time, it was Nick who looked at Wintour with skepticism. Why? I was afraid that you would become complacent, Wintour said with a laugh. You always told me that you just want a better life. I was afraid that you would take it easy as soon as your livelihood became secure. But since you now have such a grand goal, you probably have no reason to become complacent. Nick scratched the back of his head in embarrassment. Yeah, I guess so. Wintour nodded. All right then, let's deal with the corpses. Nick nodded with a smile. I've sent Pedor home for today. Jenny is currently working, And Trevor won't be here for several hours, Wintour said. They have also not been informed about our decision to give the parasite a couple of corpses, and I want to keep it that way. Working with the parasite is illegal, and if we are found out, Crimson Fungus City will crack down on us. I will be able to get through this thanks to my family, but you won't survive. I hope you understand how important this is, Wintour said. Nick nodded solemnly. I fully understand. I also don't want to die. Wintour nodded back in mutual understanding. Bring them over, Wintour said as he walked around the Dreamer's containment unit. Nick pulled the hearse behind him and followed Wintour. Near the back of the warehouse, Wintour stopped. Wintour kneeled down and pointed at one of the shiny metal plates on the ground. Since we want to keep this a secret, I can't commission someone to create easy access to the sewers, which means you have to do it. I've already looked at the blueprints of the warehouse, and I've seen where all the important pipes and cables go through. There should be nothing important below this place, which is why I want to make this the entrance to the sewers. Nick nodded and walked over to the plate. To make the warehouse stable, the screws have been welded onto the metal plates, making it effectively impossible to remove them, Wintour said as he pointed at one of the screws. I want you to tear them out without breaking them. I don't want there to be any signs. Nick nodded. Of course. Wintour also nodded and left Nick to work. Nick needed his ability active for this. Over the next 30 minutes, Nick removed the screws carefully. It was extremely difficult to remove them without destroying the welding covering their edges. Nevertheless, by carefully rotating them, Nick managed to keep the welding on the screws while removing it from the plate itself. When he was done, he called Wintour back, who nodded in appreciation. Good work, Wintour said. Now, slowly remove it. Nick removed all the screws one by one and carefully put them to the side. Then he slowly lifted the plate. The plate wasn't that heavy, which was why Nick didn't need his ability. After removing the plate, Nick saw a small and dark crawl space with another set of plates. Luckily, the second set of plates was not welded shut, but the plates were far bigger and heavier. Each plate weighed over 400 kilos. Wintour left so that Nick's ability could reactivate, and over the next 10 minutes, Nick managed to take one of the massive plates off. As soon as the plate was pushed to the side, the horrible stench of the sewers entered the warehouse. We'll have to deal with the stench, Nick thought. Luckily, nobody's here right now. Nick called Wintour back, and when Wintour saw the disgusting black abyss, he took a deep breath. Since they were not in the dregs, there were no grates that let light enter the sewers, which meant that the sewers below the warehouse were pitch black. Luckily, since the warehouse had many small holes in its ceiling, the light from the warehouse also reached the sewers, creating an isolated beam of light in a seemingly eternity of darkness. Call him, Wintour said. Nick nodded. Chapter 72, Trade Negotiations. Hey, Parasite, Nick half shouted. I'm here for our trade. Silence. Nothing. No answer came. Nick looked at Wintour with furrowed brows. Splash. Finally, a splash came from below them, and the two of them saw the head of a rat poking out of the water below them. This better be worth it, the rat said. It takes a lot of energy to get a body through the Eternal's domain. While specters weren't targeted by the nightmare, their minions were. However, someone as powerful as the parasite had some ways to get his minion through a corridor of darkness. I got the 9 corpses, Nick said. The rat seemed quite surprised when it heard that. You do? It asked in surprise. Nick nodded. Yes, I do, but I want the location of a useful specter that I can actually handle. Sure, the rat said quickly. I already know exactly which one to give you, and I am absolutely certain that you will like this one. Nick furrowed his brows and looked at Wintour. Wintour nodded. Good, Nick said. Then do we just dump the corpses in here? Can you send them down somewhere else? The rat asked. Getting that many of my minions here costs a lot of energy. No, we can't, Wintour said from the side. You know better than anyone else that nobody is allowed to help you. I can justify taking the corpses here because we are a Zephix manufacturer, and many specters need corpses, but I can't justify taking them somewhere else. I'm not going to risk my business unnecessarily. The rat didn't seem happy at all. If I get enough of my minions here to consume the corpse, I need to expend over 30% of the resources I would get from them. That means I would only get 6 instead of 9 corpses, which means I need another 4 or 5 corpses to make this a fair trade, the rat said. How you transport the corpses is not our problem, Wintour said. You told my employee when you made the offer that he only needs to dump the corpses into the sewers. You did not specify where and at what time to do it. Based on your offer, we can dump the corpses all at once without informing you into a pit of pure darkness as long as it is within the sewer's domain. Frankly, your logistical issues are not relevant to this negotiation, Wintour said. The rat really didn't like what it was hearing. Are you going to miss out on a specter just because you don't want to get 4 more corpses real quick? The rat asked. Are you? Wintour answered. You're the one going back on your word. I am not going back on my word, the parasite shouted in anger. You are effectively only giving me 6 corpses instead of 9. You're scamming me. No, we are not, Wintour answered calmly but firmly. We are the procurers of the corpses, and we are selling them at wholesale. There is a reason why the actual merchants generally ask for 30% more. If you sell the corpses to your customers, you will get the worth of 9 corpses out of them. What are you even talking about? The rat shouted. I'm not a fucking merchant. So, Wintour answered, we are the producers of said corpses. If you are not willing to sell them for more, that's not our problem. The trade agreement stands. Now, do you want the corpses right now? The rat seemed like it was about to die of anger. Fine, it shouted, but I will remember this for the future. You are free to make us a new offer after fulfilling this one. Wintour calmly answered. You might be our best option for obtaining information regarding specters right now, but if your offer is too disadvantageous for us, you will lose this position. At some point, creating an investigator team or buying specters from other manufacturers might be more cost-effective than accepting your offers. In the end, it's up to you, Wintour said evenly. The rat just glared at Wintour without saying anything for several seconds. Like father, like son, the rat grumbled. Fine. Give me some minutes. Of course, Wintour answered before looking away from the dark hole. While they were waiting, Nick saw Wintour leaning away from the hole and sighing in relief. Nick was quite surprised when he saw that. Just now, Wintour had seemed extremely confident and in control, but as soon as he was outside the parasite's perception, he lost all that confidence. Ready the corpses, Wintour said as he casually motioned for Nick to bring the hearse. Of course, Nick answered as he pulled over the hearse. Then, a couple of minutes of silence passed. I'm ready. Nick and Wintour looked into the hole again. Even though they had been prepared, a cold shudder still ran down their backs when they saw the heads of over 100 rats poking out of the water. All right, Nick answered. Want them one by one or all at once? One by one of the rats said. Nick stood up, grabbed one of the corpses, and hurled it into the hole. Splash. When the corpse hit the water, Nick saw the rats all jumping onto it with fervor. Nick didn't notice it, but the parasite's anger nearly vanished at this moment. The parasite had only asked for corpses, which meant that Nick could have also thrown in a malnourished little girl, which wouldn't have given the parasite a lot of energy. However, the corpse that Nick had thrown in was of a big and muscular man. That was a high-quality corpse for the parasite. And when Nick dumped the other corpses, the parasite actually felt like he was lucky. All of these corpses were high-quality corpses. The parasite even had to get over more rats since the corpses were so big. Eventually, all but one of the rats left. Well? Wintour asked. The rat looked at Wintour with a wide grin. I'll keep my word. I'll tell you. You're going to love this one. Chapter 73. Possession Spectre. Nick and Wintour were listening to the parasite intently. You're going to love this, the parasite said. This spectre is easy to capture, easy to find, and easy to work with. Wintour looked at the parasite with furrowed brows. That sounds a bit too good to be true. And it would be, the rat shouted. But you guys are in luck. The spectre I'm going to tell you about is my competition, and I want to get rid of him. If he weren't eating so many of my corpses, I would never give his location to anyone for just 10 corpses. Wintour just gestured for the parasite to continue. I'm calling him the Screaming Coffin, the parasite said. Screaming Coffin, Wintour repeated. Does this mean what I think it means? Yep, the rat said with a smile. It's a possession specter. The very thing all of you Zephix manufacturers want. Wintour looked at the rat with a suspicious expression. And you're going to hand that specter to us just like that? Well, the parasite slowly said, why not view it as a nice favor from me for our future negotiations? Sure, Wintour slowly said with an uncertain tone. So, where is this screaming coffin, and what does it do? Right here, the rat said. In fact, you're not even 30 meters away from it. This surprised Nick and Wintour, and they looked around. Sadly, since the sewers were so dark, they couldn't see much. This guy eats the same stuff as me, human corpses, the rat said. But he takes way longer to digest them, and he isn't very fast. The screaming coffin is moving around the bottom of the sewers, and whenever he finds a corpse, he swims toward it and consumes it. While the guy is just a hatchling, I can't overwhelm him with just my minions, which is why I have to give him corpses from time to time. In fact, I had to protect the corpses you guys gave me quite fiercely just now since he wanted them very badly. When Nick heard about the screaming coffin, he furrowed his brows. Sure, a possession specter was the best specter possible for Zephix extraction. They didn't run away. They didn't fight back. They were easy to work with. A possession specter essentially represented free money for a Zephix manufacturer. However, there was one bad thing. One couldn't attune one's Zephix synchronizer to a possession specter. This meant that Nick's issue still wasn't solved. He still needed a specter that had a high compatibility with his ability. How powerful is it? Wintour asked while Nick was thinking about the issue with his ability. Not at all, the parasite said with a dismissing tone. He has a couple of grabby tendrils, but Nick should easily be strong enough to resist it, especially since he doesn't technically have a perception since he's just an object. In fact, if Nick isn't careful, he might accidentally rip the poor guy into two. All of this sounded too good to be true, and Nick still felt suspicious. Was the parasite planning something? Thank you, Wintour said from the side. We will be capturing the screaming coffin in a couple of days. In a couple of days? The parasite repeated. Why not now? The guy is literally below me. You said the screaming coffin consumes corpses, correct? Wintour asked. The rat nodded. And we just procured 9 corpses. However, we don't have these corpses anymore. If we capture the screaming coffin right now, it needs corpses to stay placated. But if we go out and immediately get even more corpses after getting so many just hours ago, the guards might suspect us. So, we have to act like we already have the screaming coffin and that the 9 corpses went to it. Because of that, I want to wait for 3 to 5 days before capturing it. The rat didn't seem happy, but the parasite understood Wintour's decision. Fine, the parasite answered. Just call me when you need his location, but don't call me just to chat. Getting one of my minions to this isolated location wastes too much energy, and if I'm getting called for some dumb reasons, I might start charging you for my consultations. Of course, Wintour said. Thank you for the trade, and we will be calling for you when it's time to capture the screaming coffin. Sure, the rat said before diving into the water and vanishing. The next moment, Wintour turned to Nick. Close everything up. No one must know what happened. Nick was pulled out of his thoughts and nodded. After a couple of minutes, everything had been put back, and Nick looked at Wintour again. I still need a proper specter for my ability advancement, Nick said. I know, Wintour said, but it's actually extremely good that we got a possession specter this time. A smile appeared on Wintour's face. The screaming coffin probably produces a lot of Zephix since it is consuming human corpses. Specters that consume humans tend to produce a lot of Zephix in very little time. With it and the Dreamer, we will be producing a great amount of Zephix every day, which will allow us to buy more advanced things. Your advancement is still over a year away, and we have plenty of time to accumulate wealth during that time, Wintour said. Don't forget that there are not only specters roaming around that we humans haven't found yet, but that there are also ones that are simply too troublesome to capture and contain. With enough money, we might even be able to get a containment unit for a force specter, Wintour said with a smirk. Nick's eyebrows rose in positive surprise. If Nick could also choose from some force specters, his number of choices would improve tremendously. In the end, Nick accepted that getting a possession specter was a good thing. Best of all, Nick probably didn't even need to hire more Zephix extractors for the new specter. Chapter 74. One more. After getting rid of all the different signs that pointed towards a trade with the parasite, Nick left the warehouse again and dealt with Horua. By now, Nick had become completely used to dealing with Horua, and he had found his rhythm. Since it had been 3 months, Horua had grown by quite a bit. Nick even needed to buy him some new clothes. Sadly, Horua had not yet shown any signs of getting better. A couple of days ago, Nick had taken Jenny to Horua to see if she could do something with the ability she had gotten from the dreamer. When Jenny had seen how old Horua was, she had been extremely shocked. Nick had always seemed like an extremely competent and friendly boss. But now she was confronted with the fact that Nick had essentially thrown a child in front of the dreamer. This didn't fit Jenny's image of Nick at all. Nevertheless, she couldn't ignore the proof right in front of her. After Horua went to sleep, Jenny tried to view his dreams, but there weren't any. According to Jenny, Horua simply wasn't dreaming at all. The two of them asked Wintor about this the next day. After all, Wintor had been taught a lot by the tutors his family had hired. Wintor said that, normally, dreaming was simply the brain of a person reorganizing the memories they had written down that day, which was also why almost all dreams were somehow related to some thoughts one had had during that day. The fact that Horua wasn't dreaming actually wasn't very surprising. After all, Horua didn't perceive anything, which meant that he most likely didn't create new memories. So, he also didn't dream. There was simply nothing to dream about. When Nick heard that, he could only sigh. He wanted to help Horua. Horua had been in this state for a quarter of a year, and Nick knew that this wasn't a life worth living. Would he wake up on his own? The doctor said it was possible. But what if he wouldn't? Should he simply ask the dreamer to wake Horua up? But what if that caused even more pain to Horua? What if Horua would have simply woken up a week later? For now, Nick decided against using the dreamer and continued caring for Horua. Over the next couple of days, Nick only traveled between Horua and the warehouse. He didn't return to the dregs to search for another specter. Nick had to act like they had already caught a specter. 4 days after the trade with the parasite, it was time. During the late hours, Nick went into the warehouse. Even though the sun always shone, most people still slept during the night. Horua had also already gone to sleep, which meant that Nick could stay outside for around 4 hours before he had to check up on Horua again. After entering the warehouse, Nick waited for Wintor, who showed up just a couple of minutes later. At this moment, it was shortly after midnight. "You ready?" Nick asked. Wintor nodded. "Get the corpse," he said before handing Nick a token. It was a special token that gave Nick permission to create and collect 1 corpse in the dregs. Nick took the token and left the warehouse. During these hours, there were not many people on the streets, and the city felt almost dead. After some minutes, Nick entered the dregs. As soon as he arrived, he jumped on top of one building and quietly moved from rooftop to rooftop. Nick didn't want to be perceived while also having a good vantage point. He was searching for a fitting corpse. For the next couple of minutes, Nick saw a couple of groups of people walking around, but he didn't pay them any mind. They weren't doing anything shady. Nick also saw a couple of gatherings, but that was also quite normal. Many of the people of the dregs didn't feel safe at night, which was why some of them created small groups, and some of these people kept watch over the houses during the night. After a couple more minutes, Nick saw a small group of men covertly moving through the alleys. When he saw them, Nick paid special attention to them. The way they were sneaking around was suspicious, but after a bit of watching, Nick realized that they were just a small squad from the insurance gang. The insurance gang regularly walked through the dregs to advertise their services. These groups often held hundreds, if not thousands, of credits in their palms, which was why they were sneaking around like this. When he found out that they were from the insurance gang, Nick ignored them again. Some minutes later, Nick saw a woman breaking into a house. Nick didn't care. Then he saw a couple of men having sex with a woman in an alleyway. The woman didn't seem into it, but she also didn't seem too opposed, which was why Nick also ignored that. Finally, 30 minutes after arriving in the dregs, Nick found something interesting. There was a tall 25-year-old woman walking through some alleyways. Usually Nick wouldn't care, but something made this very relevant to him. The woman was wearing the badge of the Riker Strikers. When Nick saw her with the badge, he hesitated for a bit. But in the end, he knew that someone who chose to become part of the Riker Strikers couldn't possibly be a good person. So, Nick jumped down from one of the rooftops and landed on her head with his knee. Her brains splattered across the streets and dirtied Nick's clothing. However, Nick just grabbed the corpse and jumped onto one of the rooftops again. Some minutes later, Nick arrived in the outer city, and when a guard looked at him, Nick simply threw the token he had received to him. The guard looked at it, nodded, and followed Nick. When they arrived at the warehouse, the guard left. Inside the warehouse, Nick and Wintour looked at each other, and then they nodded in understanding. Chapter 75, Screaming Coffin. Nick slowly opened the plates again, and a couple minutes later, they once more looked into the sewers. Just like the last time, the sun illuminated a big spot on the surface. "Parasite, we're ready," Wintour shouted. The two of them waited for nearly half a minute. "You're ready?" a rat asked, after popping its head out of the water. Wintour and Nick nodded. "We prepared a corpse to lure it out as well," Wintour said. The rat just snorted when it heard that. "One last meal in freedom, eh?" the rat commented to itself. "Sure, that should work," the rat shouted. "The guy is currently roaming around the dregs below the surface. If he feels a corpse, he will quickly come here." "Good," Wintour answered before turning to Nick. "Are you ready?" Nick nodded and threw a rope down. The rope unfurled until its end touched the liquid of the sewers. Naturally, Nick needed a way back into the warehouse, and this rope would be his way out. Then Nick and Wintour looked at the parasite. "Silence." "What?" the parasite asked. "With you here, I can't use my ability," Nick said. "You know that." "Pfft, you don't need it," the rat said with a laugh. "The guy is a possession specter without a useful ability. Even more, the guy is only an early hatchling. Fighting him is like fighting an angry table. Trust me, I'm not going to ruin my future relationship with Dark Dream just to see you die." Nick furrowed his brows and glanced at Wintour. Wintour just shrugged casually. "All right," Nick said carefully. The next moment, Nick went away from the hole and grabbed the corpse. Splash. Nick hurled it into the water, and just a bit later, he saw it float on the surface. Silence. 20 seconds passed. "Is it coming?" Nick asked. "No idea," the rat said. "I tend to keep my minions outside of the water. It's not very healthy for them, but he should be on his way. Give it a minute." Silence. The three of them just looked at the floating corpse. "Oh, there he is," the rat suddenly said. The next moment, something white slowly rose out of the sewers beside the corpse. It was a pristine white bandage. A moment later, several more strings of bandages rose out from the sewers. Slowly they wound themselves around the corpse, and just a bit later, the corpse began to submerge. Nick took a deep breath and narrowed his eyes. Then, Nick jumped into the hole. Splash! Nick hit the water beside one of the bandages, and he immediately grabbed it. As soon as Nick held it, he felt a strong pull, and he immediately got pulled below the surface. Naturally, the water was just as disgusting as the last time, but Nick didn't have the luxury of feeling disgusted right now. He had to capture the screaming coffin. Nick didn't let go of the bandage, and he quickly got pulled more and more into the depths. Suddenly, several more white bandages appeared, and they started to come towards him slowly. Luckily, the bandages were very slow. It was almost like the screaming coffin didn't feel any urgency or anger, which was actually the case. As a possession specter that possessed an object, the screaming coffin didn't even really have a consciousness. It had the same level of consciousness as a cell. It just followed the most basic instincts. RIP. Suddenly, one of the bandages was ripped off as Nick pulled on it. "What?" Nick thought in shock. "I ripped it already?" That was when Nick realized that he was a couple of meters below the surface, which meant that neither Wintour nor the parasite could perceive him. At this moment, Nick's body was over 15 times as powerful as the body of an average adult male, and the screaming coffin was only an early hatchling. As soon as Nick ripped the bandage off, the other bandages started to slowly retreat. Even though the screaming coffin had a very basic consciousness, when one of its bandages was ripped off, it still decided to stop its attempt to consume Nick. That's problematic, Nick thought. I don't know where it is. Nick moved forward and grabbed two of the retreating bandages, but he didn't pull on them. Instead, he simply kept them in his grasp. The bandages wanted to slowly retreat, but after a couple of seconds, they started to slowly encompass Nick's arms. Nick didn't do anything. Soon, more bandages appeared around his body, and they also started to encompass him. To make sure that Nick wasn't bound in a problematic position, he kept his arms and legs apart, while also keeping all of his muscles flexed. Even if the screaming coffin managed to wrap him in several bandages, all the bandages were still attached at one end, and with a single pull, Nick could tear them off. Some seconds later, 10 different bandages had grabbed Nick's body, and he felt himself get pulled downward. Luckily, Nick was carrying a bit of arc light on his waist, which meant that the nightmare wasn't an issue right now. 10,000 credits was no longer something extremely expensive to Dark Dream. After getting pulled down for a couple more meters, something appeared. It was a luxurious black coffin. At this moment, the coffin was closed, and 12 white bandages came out of the tiny gaps between the body and the lid of the coffin. Nick looked at the coffin with narrowed eyes. As Nick got closer, the coffin slowly slid open. What? Immediately, Nick felt like he was looking at an eternal ocean of hate-filled ghosts. It was like an army of furious and unwilling corpses was screaming at Nick to join them. They hated being doomed to this eternal existence of suffering, and they had long since lost all of their rationality. All of them were filled with nothing but pure hatred for anything that didn't share their pain. Nick's body shook when he heard the hate-filled screams, but he quickly calmed down, and only one thought shot through his mind. So, that's why it's called the Screaming Coffin.